listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it's time now for another edition and another short week of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the Independent Corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am your indefatigable, ever-vigilant, burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And that means that together you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning once again, everybody. It is the start of a new week, and like I said, a short one. Quick heads up at the start of the show. We will be off this Thursday and this Friday. It's going to be Thanksgiving this Thursday, and we're taking the day off after that, too. So just a heads up. We're only going to be on the first 3 days of this week. I will be reminding you throughout the show, and then, of course, we will be resuming scheduling as normal starting next week on Monday. But anyway, again, hope everybody has a great Thanksgiving. Without further ado, though, Jamarl, how are you doing?
So far, so good. Not too bad. Looking forward to the vacation.
Oh, yeah. That'll be good. It is just past 7 a.m. Eastern here. It is November 22nd, 2021. And right at this moment, it's time now for COVID headlines in general on our show. First up, yesterday in the United States, there were 31,372 new COVID cases reported. There were also 126 new deaths recorded. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 93,689 cases per day. That is an increase of 29% from the average 2 weeks ago. 59% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. 69% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. And as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 47,692,000 people across the United States. It has killed 769,769 people. In national news, 5 people were killed and more than 40 were injured when a vehicle drove into a Christmas parade Sunday afternoon in Waukesha, Wisconsin. Witnesses described the horror of seeing individuals struck and lying on the ground after a red SUV drone cut through a series of barricades and barreled into the crowded parade route on Main Street. That was around 4:39 p.m. local time last night. This follows on from another Wisconsin story. Kyle Rittenhouse, the teenager who was acquitted of murder last week after shooting and killing 2 people in Kenosha, Wisconsin during civil unrest there last year, said he supports the Black Lives Matter movement, the BLM movement. Quote, "I'm not a racist person. I support the BLM movement," end quote. That was from an early clip from an interview that Fox News host Tucker Carlson did with Kyle Rittenhouse. That interview will be out today. That was just their sort of early preview of it. In international news, Austria on Monday became the first nation in the European Union to go into full lockdown this autumn. The 20-day national lockdown came into force at midnight, meaning that all people, vaccinated or not, can only leave their homes for essential reasons such as food, work, and school. Non-essential shops are closed. The lockdown will be reviewed after an initial 10 days as per law and possibly extended from there. Tens of thousands of people marched in Belgium and the Netherlands in sometimes violent protests that took place over the last 3 nights. They were protesting there against reinforced COVID-19 restrictions. I hear that people saw everything from like white supremacist flags to like LGBT flags. Wow. Just getting across how diverse the audience was.
Yeah.
Probably not just those 2 groups, though. Yeah. There are other groups than those 2. That just gets
you don't know, man. Maybe it was just
the Holy Alliance.
Right.
Yeah, right. Whatever. No. Almost as abruptly as she had vanished, Chinese tennis star Peng Shuai reappeared in public view over the weekend. That was on a Sunday video call between Peng and International Olympic Committee President Thomas Bach. The 3-time Olympian insisted she is, quote-unquote, safe and well living in her home in Beijing and, quote, would like to have her privacy respected, end quote. That's according to a statement from the International Olympic Committee. This comes after days of increasing calls from international observers to not hold the next Olympics in China, centering on Peng Shuai, who had made accusations against China's former vice premier, accusing him of sexual assault. And she has basically since walked those back very publicly. But, like, here's the thing. She made these accusations, then wasn't heard from for weeks. Then when she was heard from, it was like in an email written in her voice, just being like, I was wrong and I'm fine. Everything's okay. You know, she was completely silent. And then we hear from her again. And then there's bits with like photos of her coming out and people saying, you know, like shared by official Chinese sort of state media and people not being sure, okay, is this evidence that she's okay, or does it just mean that she's coerced? What does it mean exactly? Anyway, we will be talking about this a little bit later this hour, by the way, with Carl Shaw in that story. In holiday news, today is Go for a Ride Day and Love Your Freckles Day. And with both of those, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Love Your Freckles Day. I like that one. You should love yourself. Freckles and all.
You should. I guess I have some freckles, but I mostly love freckles when they're on beautiful people, beautiful women specifically. But there you go. But I do love going for rides too.
Yeah. Very cute. Like I said, man, there's a holiday for pretty much everything.
Oh yeah.
But it undermines the holidays. That's the only thing. It's like if it's Dad's Day, Father's Day, I have a dog, and somebody says, "Hey, Happy Father's Day." It's like, why you tell me Happy Father's Day? Well, you have a dog. Doesn't it somehow undermine the premise of the day? Yeah, a little bit. It's kind of that feeling.
I was literally thinking last week, I was like, wow, there are all these holidays. You know what I should do is, as a sort of psyop, I should get into creating new holidays just to weaken the idea of holidays in general. Because I've always kind of had a thing out for holidays. It's like, why is this day different? Why
is it special?
Yeah, why do we got to take this one day just to give each other gifts or be nice to each other or say thank you to each other or something like that? You know what I mean? So like me, I don't like holidays particularly. So my thought is I can destroy them by weakening them by creating a lot more holidays. It's kind of like holiday inflation.
Yeah. Just think you might be the protagonist for this.
Exactly.
Might have been something that came back in time in order to.
Yeah.
And you're like, man, this is a great idea. Who came up with this? And then
I did.
Find yourself right.
I did. Plot spoiling the movie, which shall not be identified. But
right, it's not a plot spoil.
It's not a plot spoil. We don't have any idea what we're talking about. No.
But no, man, that's funny. Have you seen the reporting over the week? It's been historical, actually, with them saying Russia is preparing to invade Ukraine, right, by January or February. I mean, very specific time frame. And, this is while they're doing their own war games in like Estonia, and NATO is doing their own war games. What I didn't realize, though, and this was something Alexander Mercouris actually, he made a point about a Biden-Putin summit part 2, and that this is basically something that the United States and Russia have basically been planning, despite the fact all this reporting is taking place. This has become very weird stuff. But Ukraine is clearly redlined, right? I mean, look at what the United States was willing to do in order to keep Russian missiles out of Cuba. And that's one country. I mean, think about it when you have all of Europe and all of these forces are kind of gathered around putting more and more pressure on your border.
It's true, but last I checked, the Russians didn't want to invade Ukraine.
I don't think they want to invade Ukraine.
The Ukrainian troops on the ground, maybe, and we always have our biases or our lenses on things, so I'm only hearing about things from certain people, but it made perfect sense, and when I looked into it, all the facts supported it. It was like the local Ukrainians on the ground weren't actually saying the Russians want to invade. It was the outside Americans who were saying it. Whether it was Lloyd Austin on his trip to Ukraine about a month ago, which, if I recall correctly, that was when some of these early claims started to circulate. Yeah. Or Bill Burns speaking with, the Russians, going to Moscow, that whole thing. That was a couple weeks ago. I don't know. There's been this churn of not like top-level diplomats, but not Biden. Yeah. In between the two meetings.
Yeah, Biden has never come out and said anything like that.
Biden hasn't said this stuff. But why is that happening? Why are we doing this? Is it leverage over Russia going into the next meeting? I'm reminded of how little these meetings actually accomplish, and how if they're good for anything, it's just, okay, we're talking again. Yeah. That's good.
It's nothing else.
Yeah. Yeah. But are we angling for something else with this one? Because a couple things come to mind, and I don't want to speculate, but what do you think's going on here, Jamarl?
I got to be honest, I'm not entirely sure. Part of me thought that maybe this is to cover action either by NATO or by the Ukraine itself, meaning, we're going to put this propaganda out in order to draw attention to X so people aren't paying attention to Y. That was one thought. The other thought was maybe Ukraine is trying to get something out of this. And the other thought, maybe they're trying to mitigate Russia's behavior or mitigate any level of action by Russia by bringing this up in the beginning, in forefront.
Making it such a big deal that if they do anything on Ukraine, it's like, oh, see, you guys are, et cetera, et cetera. So
exactly.
It's like
so it could be like a combination of things. But I often think they put out propaganda like this in order to cover their own behavior and this stuff. Maybe. So it could be a combination of all that stuff.
But also, here's the thing: for who say they're setting up this narrative, and in order for Russia to not want to step over some whatever line, which this narrative is for like the Western public's consumption, I would think.
Exactly, domestic consumption.
And Russia has done pretty much what it's wanted to and what's made sense to it as a country, regardless of what the Western public thinks for a long time now. Which is why with the 2013-2014 Euromaidan crisis and the whole Ukrainian revolution and the separatism movement in Donbass and what's the other one? In the Donbass. In the Donetsk and Luhansk. Yeah. I was forgetting the two names of the
government. Right.
Anyway, with that whole process, occasionally you've heard versions of the Russian side, but Russia did what sort of made sense there, in my opinion, regardless of what the West thinks, because the whole narrative in the West since then has been, hey, this was a big coup, basically, that Russia forcefully annexed these regions. That's been the narrative. I guess my point is they'll do what they want to do. I don't know. One thing that comes to mind with this is maybe we're trying to, and again, I was saying speculation at a time. Sad that we have to go into it, but maybe it's just we want leverage. You know, it's a sort of similar version of that. It's just in general, it's not to necessarily keep them from this, but it's like maybe we want to create this perception internationally that, okay, we're trying to come to the table, but they keep doing these things. They keep escalating in these ways. Yeah. We want that to set that as the narrative. We want that to be our talking point so that we can justify either not having more meetings with them or doing crap to them in those meetings. Does that make sense?
Basically, nothing gets accomplished because we're bringing these issues up as a sticking point.
Yeah, because you guys keep doing this. And, whatever this actually is. Well, in this case, the allegation, of course, is that they're preparing to invade Ukraine. Yeah. But we can make that accusation regardless of the reality and then be like, okay, since you guys are doing this, we're going to do this to you. We're going to levy more sanctions on you or, throw several more $100 billion into Ukrainian defense, which is way too much to put in Ukraine, admittedly. But
I mean,
that kind of thing.
It's always unsettling, not unsettling, unfortunate that America doesn't, meaning the media puts out a particular story, and it doesn't seem that America thinks to themselves, okay, how does this apply to us? Meaning, if the moment that you have a country like the U.S., and that country is willing to basically destroy the world in order to keep missiles out of Cuba, then it's weird that you would have a situation where the country would have to explain themselves into why getting closer and closer and putting weapons on their border will bring in some level of consternation about it. It's almost like, yeah, that was us. This is you guys. And for some reason, we're different species of human where this shouldn't necessarily apply to you. It's nonsense. If we were willing to do it, Russia's, to your point, Russia's going to do whatever it takes. It's in its best interest, geopolitical security and everything else. And regardless of the propaganda that takes place, that's more for our consumption, like Western nations' consumption and everything else for the U.S. or those nations to try to get whatever they want in regards to Russia. But no, Russia has a very specific issue. I mean, you basically have enemy countries at your border and continuously trying to expand those borders to get closer and closer to your country. I mean, what do you do in that situation? The U.S. was willing to end the world. Shouldn't Russia care that these countries are getting closer and closer and try to find ways to mitigate that closeness? And just so happened, Ukraine is one of those main points. I mean, if Ukraine fell, you're talking about basically literally on the border of Russia at that point with a huge country that was clearly within Soviet's orbit. Now, all of a sudden being this kind of pivot point into the country.
And by fell, you mean become a NATO member.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's seemingly where a lot of this conversation goes. That's shocking in and of itself that you would ever want Ukraine to be part of NATO. It looks like we start a war immediately.
Ukraine would, things can happen unexpectedly, of course, over decades. Things can change. But right now, it seems like Ukraine would only become part of NATO if the United States and the EU want Ukraine to become part of NATO, because we're planning on using it as our immobile aircraft carrier and HAB or whatever, our deployment station, basically, for a war conflict with Russia going forward. We would have to do that. And right now the mode has been, okay, we're pivoting to China, right? Yeah. And then I saw an article about, maybe a pivot to China means we need to focus on, who is the key official? It was a key official saying just over the last couple of days, a pivot to China requires that we double down in opposing Russia or whatever. So there's no pivot, if that makes sense. There's just, adding in another opponent or whatever to this fray. I guess my point was we've been in an unclear mode, and we still are in an unclear mode where we may be pivoting against long-term tensions with Russia to long-term tensions with China. But if you assume that, why are we doing this? Yeah. What does this mean?
It's so weird.
Because right now, Ukraine is such a poor country with such long-term economic and political problems and internal rivalries and divisions that it'd be a lot of money spent through NATO making it, I would think, a viable strategic partner in any long-term race. Against Russia. That's a big, big project. We really want that? Or are we just trying to keep it open as a possibility so that
I think it's the latter.
And it's the same thing with Taiwan and Ukraine. I'm not making them a direct parallel between them in terms of the relationships with China and Russia, respectively.
It's this bulkhead or this
exactly
thing, like right at the border of the country, or right
door.
Within, right. And
yeah, your
especially
ledge, your step onto it
from countries that were within the orbits of those countries that we're talking about.
100%.
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't know, man. It's always weird to me that the U.S. media, or for that matter, Americans, can't look at that situation and think, well, how would we respond in that situation? Well, we don't have to think it. We saw it. And so it's like, not to mention, this seems to be foolhardy. I mean, they're basically creating a pretext for war with multiple countries, both of which on their own way of somewhat super powerful countries. And so it's like, like you said, it's not even a pivot to China at that point if you're still creating hostilities with Russia. Not to mention, what's the point of these summits if you're going to keep putting out this type of propaganda? Because the U.S. would say,
I'm sure the Russians are left scratching their head thinking the same thing. What's the point of these summits if you're going to keep doing this kind of thing?
Exactly.
What are you actually angling for?
Yeah. I mean, because clearly Russia has their own airlines. They have things that they want out of any kind of negotiation. I would imagine one of those things is get those weapons from out of those countries that are on their border. I would imagine they would even want some kind of treaty or some kind of deal. But the problem becomes, well, any other deal that we sign, we basically torched in a heartbeat when it didn't necessarily suit our interests. So it's like, in that situation, how do you even come to a legitimate deal that will stay into effect, good or bad, or as you propagate through time? We don't know that. Based on Trump tore those agreements up within a heartbeat, didn't think twice about it. And so it's like all of those things are somewhat problematic. It's like...
Well, I mean, we're actively competing with them diplomatically, and of course militarily in the long run, although there aren't right now like major active skirmishes. We're not in a third world war, et cetera. But like wanting to keep Ukraine and Taiwan open as potential bulkheads and just as destabilizing factors in the planning of, the leaders of Russia and China, completely viable strategy if we're wanting to treat them as opponents.
Yes.
It's just what our long-term trajectory is going to be.
Yes.
If we wanted a détente with them, we could give them promises, extreme promises, probably in the next administration or the administration after that or whatever. If this were to happen, it would be like, we formally disavow any support for separatist movements and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then, and in the spirit of impartiality, we've decided to withdraw these forces and we'll leave local regional partners in these diplomatic processes to decide for themselves what this is going to look like.
Yeah.
Now, in the case of, I don't know what that means in the case of Ukraine specifically. In the case of Taiwan, that means China, quote unquote, wins.
Yes.
They get Taiwan back. But that's just the call we've got to make depending on where you want to take the foreign policy.
Yes.
Are we wanting to take China to the mat on this one? Because if we do, like you bring
up, how
many Americans are going to lose their lives? What is that going to mean? Is that worth it for us?
Yeah.
Or are we just big on our bridges and too used to spending on military and not used to spending on roads? And so we think that everything that we see is a nail for our hammer that we need to blow up or something. You know what I mean?
Not to mention the provocative behavior. I think it's almost like we've gotten so accustomed to this notion that U.S. dictates the rest of the world, what they do, how they respond, and everything else, that negotiation doesn't seem to all that much be a factor in the way that it used to be. And so you have something like, for example, Russia has been trying to get a cybersecurity deal. They've been trying to get a no weapons in space deal. U.S. doesn't want any of these things. And, even when you get into the notion of Taiwan, it's a certain amount of brinksmanship where we're going to sail our boats into your territory. We're going to push the borders, despite the fact we told you we weren't going to push the borders. And it's the expectation that they're not going to do anything about it. How do you know that? And at some point, you do hit a red line. And my fear is that you get so accustomed to this level of brinksmanship and just so accustomed to this thinking that the other people aren't going to respond in a particular way that you cross into a red line thinking, well, we're the, hegemon on this planet. They're not going to do anything to provoke a war as you provoke a war. It's that stuff. Like, I don't necessarily know where that ends, and I don't necessarily think these guys have a competence, I mean, just looking at the COVID numbers in general, to skate their way out of it in the way that Kennedy was able to skate his way out of the conflict. I have no faith in that. Yeah. None at all. So, but let's do this. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
ever. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C., and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri, daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can always catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with the chat, the tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So, as we know, the bipartisan infrastructure bill has passed. That's something that Biden signed into law last week. And we have BBB, Build Back Better. Now, this was the $3.5 trillion that went to $1.75 trillion, and this has just passed the House. How did it pass the House? If you remember, Democrats, moderates, right-wing Democrats were basically waiting on the CBO score, the Congressional Budget Office. This is supposed to be basically a bipartisan office or nonpartisan office that basically is just counting zeros and ones. We're just counting the numbers. This is all this is. They don't have a dog in the hunt, supposedly. And so the Democrats basically said, we're going to wait for the CBO score. And if the CBO score comes back within range that Biden says it is, meaning it's paying for itself, then fine, we'll sign it. Now, if you remember, lefties had all sorts of consternation on this because lefties basically was using leverage of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and both of those things needed to go together as a way of compelling moderates and right-wing Democrats who they didn't trust, who was getting all sorts of cash, looking at used cinema and Manchin from drug companies and these other companies, and even for Republicans who are basically applauding Manchin and cinema holding up Biden's agenda, if not stopping it altogether. You went off of 4 or 5 months with the public looking at what was taking place in Congress, and seems like Biden is not living up to his campaign promises, even in things that he had the power to do. Biden is not going to the mat for his campaign promises, such as the $15 minimum wage, which he calls a starvation wage, which means, by definition, Biden is okay with people having a starvation wage. He's the one who named it that. I didn't name it that. And yet, full-term starvation, and to be okay with that looks bad, especially if you're president of the United States and you fought and argued over that very basic point over the course of several months. The public looks at you and thinks, these guys can't get anything done, despite having the House, the Senate, and the presidency. So, in this very specific case, despite spending all of that time fighting, all of that time negotiating, all of that time using the leverage of both bills in order to kind of get both of those bills passed, you have a situation where they were finally split. So now what happened? The CBO score comes back, and it has Biden, give or take, $400 billion loss, meaning the bill doesn't necessarily pay for itself. Now, there's a discrepancy in this, though, depending upon what you're thinking. The CBO score is basically saying that the amount of money that the U.S. is going to be able to get back from internal revenue, or basically taxes, is not going to be as much as Biden is forecasting. They're basically saying that there's going to be somewhat of a budget hole in that particular provision. Biden is believing that he's going to be able to get more money back on that front. And you can say, yes, he's probably embellishing somewhat. If you're the one who are writing that bill, you're trying to get as much as possible. You want your party to basically go along with it. And yeah, you may raise your numbers a little bit higher than normal. Every incentive in the world is to do that. On the other part, the argument can be made, though, that in the same way that you're putting these new tax provisions and new empowering the Internal Revenue Service to do X or to do Y, that various actors, especially those with means, are going to be paying their particular accountant, their particular accounting team to find other loopholes and other ways to avoid paying that tax. So whereas Biden might put in, we're going to get X amount of billions from this, hundreds of billions from this, well, the CBO looks at it and says, well, no, you're not going to get that much because people are going to conform and find ways to subvert whatever tax plan you're coming up with. Nevertheless, the Democrats in the House still went along with it. They didn't use that as a final sticking point. So now it goes to the Senate. What happens in the Senate? That's the question. People are looking at Manchin and Sinema, again, who's getting all sorts of cash, not to mention support from right-wingers or from the rich in their own areas, to basically do exactly what they've been doing, which is to undermine the president's agenda. We have a clip from Manchin. I want you to hear this. I'm going to give the engineer a bit of time to pull it. But basically, Manchin now is making an argument that, hey, man, inflation is rough, so I don't know if we're going to go with this. The Biden administration, to its tune, has also jumped on the inflation bandwagon in the opposite reason, saying Build Back Better is going to be phenomenal for inflation. I have no idea why they think this. I have no idea how they're coming to this particular conclusion. And if anything, it sounds like they're coming to this conclusion because inflation is such a big issue and becomes such a big item in regards to the American public, the talking points in regards to mainstream media, and for that matter, even attacks from Republicans and Joe Manchin himself, that they're basically trying to change and cast this plan that's supposed to be this kind of human or soft infrastructure as to now a cure for inflation. It is decidedly not. It is decidedly not a cure for inflation. Let's play the clip. This is President Manchin basically asked whether or not he's going to support the bill. Let's play the clip.
You were just back home for a week. Do your voters want this bill, this big, massive bill right now?
I think my voters in West Virginia, but I don't speak for the whole country. My voters are a lot differently, but they're very much concerned. Inflation has hit them extremely hard. They have to drive. Their mileage for driving to work is quite onerous on them. And the cost, they see it every day. Every day they go up and fill up, it's $1.25 more a gallon. So they're in $3.29, $3.39. Gallon of milk is now around $4 in many places, and it's taking a toll. And I hear it when I go to the grocery store, or if I go to the gas station. They say, "Are you as mad as I am?" And I says, "Absolutely."
So Manchin is basically still unclear on whether he's going to push this over the finish line. Cinema, same thing. Unclear or whether they're going to push this over the finish line. So Biden basically is just in the wings. Lefties has given up all of their, let's say, political clout in this situation with hopes that Manchin passes the bill. And they're on some level dependent upon Biden to go with this. I got to be honest, this is somewhat annoying for this process to be dragging on to this much and for the main provisions and the things that would have had the most significance in the American public. And not just the most significance in the American public, the items that they wanted the most. You're in a pandemic where nearly 800,000 Americans have dropped dead over the course of a year and a half. And the most popular provision, either the Medicare for All or expansion of Medicare to include eyeglasses and dental, not to mention adding that many more Americans on there, millions of more Americans making them eligible, that's off the table. That's your most popular provision. The $15 minimum wage that was there prior. Again, extremely popular because that's money that would have been going directly into people's pockets. Yes, I don't doubt that there are going to be other items in that bill that are popular, but this omnibus bill could have been cast in a particular way, and it should have been fought for going to the mat, especially for the things that the American public wanted. Meaning, if you have something that is polling through the roof, look like you would fight tooth and nail to get those things over the finish line, and that's not necessarily what's happened. Not just that, you've taken so long that the image of Biden from the standpoint of the American public may already be set, and it may be something that you can't necessarily change or extricate yourself from within the course of the next year, especially if people aren't going to be able to see how this affects their bottom line in the course of that year before the midterms. Biden may get this passed, but I don't think it's going to have the effect that many of the Democrats wanted to have. I think at this point, it's a little too late. And like I said, the items that would have been the most profound items in the bill are just not there, at least not in the way that the American public will want them or their favorites. We don't even know if this is going to include the prescription drug benefit, meaning having Medicare negotiate drug prices, which again is a massive, massive deal while you're in the middle of a pandemic with over 1,000 people dropping dead a day. It's unfortunate. This could have been so much more. Biden administration could have been so much more if you had a president that actually believed it. You had a Congress and a group around him that was actually willing to push for it and go to the mat for it. If they were willing to use the mob in order to get that stuff accomplished, and by mob, I just mean not necessarily keeping this to be a political process, but you're also wielding the public itself to put pressure on the various other members that aren't necessarily backing your agenda within the context of your party. At this point, though, at this point, we're in somewhat of a weird situation where it's unclear what's going to happen next week, whether or not they're going to pass this going into December, considering everything else that is going on. But I will say this administration could have been far different. And the outcome for this, I suspect, is not going to be all that well of the Democratic Party. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to be back in a moment with the one and only Carl Jha, talking about issues pertaining to the U.S. and China. Back shortly.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together, well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Over the weekend, as I'm looking through stories and looking through some of the chatter that's taking place on social media, I came across this notion of the UK and the United States basically boycotting or threatening to boycott the Beijing Olympics. Now, this is pretty astonishing. Oftentimes what they're trying to use on this is human rights as a way of trying to go against China. This is just another area of quote-unquote deep competition in the way that the U.S. and its vassal states are going about this. Considering this country was just now revealed that we killed like 60 women and children, and then recently killed another 7 women and children, then this has basically been the way wars have been waged, despite the fact they haven't even called them wars, over the last 20 years. We could still point our finger and say that those guys are betraying human rights. It's astonishing. It's just like the Tillis memo said. You basically attack people who are not your friends on issues of human rights, while your friends who have atrocious levels of human rights issues, let's say Saudi Arabia, for example, gets a complete pass. And now this has gone all the way to the Olympics. We have a conversation about this and other issues that are taking place right now. We're joined with Carl Jha. He's host of Silk and Steel podcast focused on China and surrounding regions and their history, politics, and culture. Carl, how's it going, my man? Thank you for joining us.
Hey, hello again.
Absolutely. So I want to start with the Beijing thing. I mean, there's a few other issues to get to, but what is China's thoughts on this? I mean, this just seems to be another level of, okay, we need to find something else to pick with China about. And using the Beijing Olympics as one of the ways to basically do this. Has China responded to this at all? And what has been their take on this kind of, I guess you can say, pivot in this particular regard?
I don't think China had made any official statement about this, but this is ridiculous, as you pointed out. I mean, if first they tried to use all kind of excuse to boycott the Olympics. First, it was the so-called Uyghur genocide. I mean, if they really believe there's a real genocide going on, they should just boycott, no question.
Well, not just boycott, stop dealing with them business-wise. I mean, you have these huge trade relationships, and you're basically saying these guys are the Nazis. Okay, fair enough. If that's true, then what's the feeling today of people who were basically trading with the Nazis while they were committing genocide and murdering the Jews in that way? You know what I mean? Like, it's illogical on its face. It's like, oh, no, we're going to keep these trade relationships, but these guys are basically Nazis. It's nonsense. I'm sorry, Carl. Please finish.
Yeah. I mean, they're just using it as a tactic now, a negotiation chip. And the U.S. has always used human rights as a negotiation chip, as a kind of club to beat on government they don't like. And in particular case, now they're trying to use a pen strike case as an excuse to talk about boycott Olympics. I mean, this is a country that had a huge scandal on the U.S. gymnastic team, and we are gonna use the pen strike case happening in China as an excuse to boycott. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, it actually does make sense to me. I know why they're doing this, but logically, it's totally ridiculous.
So here's the thing. On a general case, there's a lot of stuff that I agree with you on. But in the specific case, it's also kind of weird. And I'll put it like this. I don't think that we should be boycotting China's Olympics over this. I agree that seems like merely a political move. But, it is kind of weird. Maybe we can get into the specifics of the case. Peng Shuai, tennis player, a couple weeks ago made accusations against the former vice premier of China. was sensed, and this is, again, super highlights. I'll leave it to you to clean up any inaccuracies, Carl, or any, fill in any missing holes, that kind of thing. She makes these accusations. She has not heard from for a couple of weeks. Then we hear from her in the form of a sort of short email written in her voice saying that the things that she said were wrong and she retracts them, but she's doing fine. People speculate, hey, she's being coerced. Maybe she's even dead. Some people go that far. Then a couple days ago, over the weekend, media comes out, photos come out of her, video comes out of her at a party, multiple videos have now come out, that kind of thing, confirming, okay, no, she's alive. But people still speculate, maybe she's being coerced, not necessarily violently, but coerced nonetheless. And then this, sort of hits at these larger notions of China as this authoritarian, heavy-handed state that will, suppress local dissent, even if it's just a tennis player making a sexual harassment allegation. That's a sort of high-level narrative going on over in the States, and it's an interesting case. Carl, what do you see? What do you think I might have got wrong or framed incorrectly in the way that I framed that? Because I think that is how the West sees this one. But Carl, take it away.
Right. I mean, I highly for people who really want the whole 9 yards details, they actually can go check out the Reddit translation of Pen Shuai's original Weibo post. So what we know about this case right now is what Pen Shuai posted on her verified Weibo account. And very soon it went viral in China. Everybody knew about it, but the censors, either she removed it or the censor removed it. That Weibo post was gone, but not before everybody took screenshot and shared it around. So now everybody knew about it. Now the content of this post obviously is in Chinese. There are different translations, but this is one instance where one rare instance, I would say, Reddit become useful. I read the Reddit English translation. I read the original Chinese post. The Reddit translation actually comes pretty close. So basically, Pen Shuai related her kind of the whole affair, sexual entanglement with a former vice premier of China. And she said that after not seeing her for 7 years, originally they had a sexual relationship more than 10 years ago, but when he became the vice premier, he stopped it. And then after like 7 years not basically ghosting her, he invited her to his own home with his wife, and there he pressured her to have sex with him. That's the language she used. She said he pressured her and she did not agree, but then she stayed on to have dinner with him and his wife. So it's with the full knowledge of the wife. So obviously the vice premier has some kind of open relationship with the wife. And what she said someone was, when the vice premier took her to the room and pressure to have sex, there's someone outside, and it was not very clear. I think almost seems like she was implying that the wife was on the lookout, kind of guard their house, because the next sentence she said, it's so unbelievable that the wife would agree to do this. Yeah. And then she stayed on to have dinner with them. And she said after dinner, she still did not agree to have sex. At that point, the vice premier, or former vice premier, told her that he hated her. He never forget her through all 7 years, and how much he misses her. And then she said she felt scared and panicked, and then she had a very mixed feel, and because she recalled the fond affection she did feel for him 7 years ago, finally she did agree to have sex with him. And so she was definitely pressured into having sex. But after that, they continued their relationship. They continued the affair for another 3 years, and they keep on seeing each other. But what happened was that he didn't want to make the affair public, even though the wife already know, and she wanted more than just a secret affair. But he told her that at his position, divorce is impossible, and he just wanted to keep it under wraps, have her on the side as a secret mistress. And then she got upset, and then on top of that, even though the wife was kind of okay, but when he's not around, the wife will making snide remarks that is very humiliating for her. So she decided enough is enough. Yeah. That's why she posted this her Weibo post. So this, if the allegation is true, this is a very powerful man, a very manipulative man. Manipulated her, pressure a woman much younger than him. I think there's like a 30-year age gap between them. The former vice premier is now like 75 or something like that. So this is something that we know happens in many societies, and it's very. This is something very, very creepy. Very, like, this deserves to be condemned. Well, what happened next? I think it's a combination of self-owned by the Chinese censors, because if she didn't remove the post herself, then the Chinese censor removed it. And then when other people try to post screenshot on Chinese social media, a lot of those posts are being removed. So Pen Shuai's Weibo account is still up. I checked. But what happened is that all the comment section on her previous posts have been disabled. So I'm pretty sure the censor did that. And that created the impression that, maybe Pen Shuai is in trouble. So, and then, we have, then the Western media, of course, pounce on it because they look for anything to paint China in the worst possible light. And there's like conspiracy saying, first, like I see people even saying stuff like maybe Pen Shuai has been killed, maybe like, why she's been disappeared. It's the same kind of a talk that when Alibaba's founder, Jack Ma, disappeared from public view, there was a big media frenzy also about how China disappeared Jack Ma. But eventually Jack Ma surfaced. But this is, I think, this is one of the way that it's a self-owned on China's part, because the overactive censorship, and also how the Chinese state media handle it. Here in the West, we're told like the Chinese propaganda is some powerful machine that's gonna brainwash people. But if you watch the Chinese state media actually in action, it's pretty pathetic. They posted supposedly her email, which raised the question: how did the Chinese state media get hold of her email? And then they posted the moments from her WeChat. Again, leaves the question: how did the state media get to her friend circle? None of that explained, and the video that released has a clear date. They have a very clear focus on the date that was showing. This was yesterday. So every bits of it looks staged. So people obviously this is all going to raise all kind of questions, especially outside of China, especially in the Western coverage of China. China is already under microscope, and the Chinese state media is not helping themselves by doing all these very clumsy attempts to kind of debunk so-called the Pen Shuai case.
Carl, I want to cut him very briefly, because that's an very fair and I think accurate and just balanced summary of what's happened here. And looking into the translation, which I had not read, and I'm sure a lot of folks hadn't, by the way, you can find for yourself. Peng Shuai we're talking about. Her name is spelled, by the way, for the audience, P-E-N-G S-H-U-A-I. If you're curious, if you're hearing what we're talking about and you're like, wait, how do I find out about this? And you can search that name, P-E-N-G S-H-U-A-I. You can do a search for that. And if you look up Reddit translation, you'll see the translation of her original sort of letter on this. And again, it's pretty readable reading through it. Now, here's a couple things still come to mind, Carl. But I'll start with this one. Why would state censors be covering for the former vice premier? I would understand that this is the former vice premier. He's going to have power. He's going to want, if he's manipulative, which it sounds like he is, he's going to use that power to get what he wants. And so I could see him potentially coercing her on the back end, doing something like that. But state censors getting involved. This is covering for a former vice premier's sexual assault, or alleged sexual assault, that kind of thing. And I get it's complicated, but still, they're covering for it. This is the state intervening to, on the behalf of a former vice premier. Wouldn't the West be right to hit them on this, even though they completely don't understand the specifics of the case? What's your take on it, Carl?
Okay, so this is my personal take, right? I mean, the Western media come from obviously come from very, very bad faith. But I think it's a good thing. I actually think it's a good thing. You actually force the Chinese state media have to respond to provide whereabouts of Peng Shuai, whether she's okay or not, and they can't just keep it under wraps. So at the time, I say the Western media is going crazy, trying to paint a bad light of China. It doesn't mean all the effect is negative. The positive effect is forcing China in a way to be more transparent. And as you mentioned, why would the Chinese censor cover for a former vice premier? This is something, an aspect of Chinese censorship I've complained about over and over again, is the Chinese state censors want to control the narrative on everything. Because what happened is this is a very big scandal, and you will invite a lot of public discussion. And what they're afraid of, invariably, it will lead to the discussion about kind of the nature of the Communist Party and the relationship between the government and the state and the people. And so the censor really don't want that. They don't want too many controversies.
We have that here in the States. A lot of people internationally, of course. The Hunter Biden story, I would allege, is in its own way a much bigger scandal than what we're describing in this case. You have the literal son of the current sitting president, the son, the main guy, who did all this stuff, prostitutes and crack cocaine and all these things, in a very high-profile case that was systematically and meticulously suppressed by local social media platforms. And I don't know, I don't use Weibo. I'm not sure how your censors work exactly, but you were saying they don't work too well. Here in the States, I would argue they work pretty well. People trying to send direct messages on Twitter with details in this Hunter Biden story and having the links automatically hidden so they couldn't literally communicate. And again, people can see it, and I don't know how, everybody sort of sees what's happening. And so I don't know what they can ultimately do to combat that. But in terms of actually suppressing the story, we have that in common here in the States. And so I don't want to come to you so sort of uber critically as a Western media outlet, with a lack of understanding. We have some shared problems here, but it's also a worrying case,
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, the problem with Chinese censor trying to control narrative on everything, they end up owning everything. I mean, in this case, Chinese government didn't have to insert itself between a feud between a tennis player and the former vice premier. I mean, he's not even in office anymore. The Chinese government could totally just distance themselves with this thing and be done with it. But no, this is they're kind of the urge for control on the censor side to control everything, and then that means that they end up owning everything. And the worst impulse that triggers a worst impulse on the Western media is saying, okay, oh my God, Peng Shuai is probably getting arrested and probably being held under, against her will. And in a way, all the frenzy, I think in a way the scrutiny is good because it does force the Chinese state media have to respond. And when the scandal first broke out, I mean, most of the Chinese, I think, probably have the same thoughts that Peng Shuai is just getting muzzled, but nobody really seriously thought Peng Shuai is in some kind of personal danger, her safety is in danger. That's what a lot of the Western media is implying.
Yeah, and even muscled.
They were implying.
That's 100%. And even muscled, I would just assume she's getting not even a stern talking to necessarily, but just a talking to or something, that party officials would be coming down and having conversations with her, or that mutual friends between her and the former vice premier, that kind of who the heck knows? My point is, you're right in saying that that's where the West is going with it, but that doesn't seem justified either before these photos or videos came out or even after it. It's a possibility, but it would seem like an overreaction. You just want to talk to her if you're trying to get her to stop saying that stuff.
I mean, all they have to do is, but right now, after all this video of her surface, after she made a Zoom call with the IOC chairman, the people are still spinning this is not acceptable, because in reality nothing is acceptable. they want Peng Shuai to go to the Washington Post headquarters and make a statement denouncing the Communist Party. That will be the only acceptable solution basically for the Western media at this point. But I'm just glad. Looks like Peng Shuai is in good spirit. Looks like she's okay. At this, and also I hope it will be a learning a learning opportunity for like the Chinese censors that they don't have to freaking cover everything. And I do think there's a serious possibility that the vice premier might be investigated, because the thing is, Peng Shuai didn't make a formal charge against him about sexual harassment. So like the Chinese court can handle it at this point. But he's a former vice premier, but however, he's still a member of the Communist Party. So within the Communist Party, they have the Communist Party disciplinary committee that kind of handle all these kind of extra legal investigation into his party members. So it's very likely that this former vice premier will be investigated. And like during those big anniversaries, like the 100 years anniversary, all these leaders and former leaders sometimes get invited to show up on top of Tiananmen Gate and inspecting the parade. I bet former vice premier Zhang Gaoli is not going to show up in public anytime soon. And he it's my hope that he did get investigated. I do believe Peng Shuai deserves some justice. I mean, if her allegation is true, and at the same time, he also makes maybe hopefully makes the Chinese government realize, sometimes a little bit transparency is the best. So at least it doesn't have to attract all these kind of unwanted attention from the Western media, who are just basically flies attracted to any crack in the egg.
Yeah, they're looking for anything to basically jump on. Carl, I want to move slightly, or pivot a bit, not slightly, significantly so, over into Ethiopia. In reading over the weekend, Ethiopia and China basically have a trade relationship. In fact, China is its main trading partner, pretty much for anyone else. 21% of, let's say, brand new projects originated in the United States, 31% originated in China. And this kind of goes to this African pivot that China has basically had. I mean, it's all sorts of relationships, financial relationships with Africa. And that was something that was obvious to see when I was in Kenya a few years ago. From what's their perspective on this? I mean, they've seen kind of the West and the way the West has basically been intruding into what has been going on, even in the way that it talks about it, like just the propaganda that goes around it. I mean, this article from the Washington Post doesn't even bring up the fact that the TPLF started the conflict. I mean, and they're acting as if, the West has been more neutral on this process and everything else. How has China regarded this conflict, considering that they're one of Ethiopia's main trading partners, or the main trading partner in Ethiopia?
This is a good question, because actually, in terms of China's perspectives, it doesn't really matter which side wins the conflict, because if you look at China's pragmatic diplomatic history, China will work with whoever is in power. This happened in the conflict in Sudan. I mean, U.S. was actively backing the Southern Sudanese rebels to have an independent Southern Sudan, and they position it as a way to win off Sudan off the Chinese influence, because at that time most of the oil in Sudan is in South Sudan, and PetroChina has a big operation over there. But instead, that's one of the George Bush's crowning achievement, was celebrating the independence of South Sudan. But right after South Sudan became independent, China moved in, established relationship, continue to pump oil. So nothing, from China's side, they will deal with whatever is internationally recognized government. So whether it's a TPL, because the TPLF, they used to rule Ethiopia for a long time,
27 years,
and they just been like last few years they've been dislodged. But whether Ethiopia was in TPF control or the current president Abiy control, China always had a working relationship with Ethiopia. So it's really like U.S. what. I actually would like to talk about, I don't know if you guys seen that recent New York Times article on how U.S. lost ground to China in Congo. I mean, that is a more, it's mind-boggling that New York Times, the paper of record, is so open about, advocating for a U.S. empire in Africa. I think because the Ethiopia story is a little bit more complicated. So this is also like an ethnic conflict between the Tigrayan and the ethnic Tigrayan and also the other ethnic group in Ethiopia, Amhara, and that's always, when you try to talk about ethnic conflict, it's always fraught. It ends up taking, which side you're taking on, and U.S. in Ethiopia plays a very ambiguous role because Abiy, U.S. have been friendly with Abiy's government as well. Abiy was invited to like Davos and like all the, but at the same time, U.S. kind of belatedly pivoted to the Ethiopian conflict.
Yes.
Especially now they're talking about the, human rights atrocities that's happening in Ethiopia, and particularly among the U.S. military. There's a couple articles. There's one in Foreign Policy says U.S. Ethiopians should trust U.S. to come in and do an intervention. And there's another article by a former.
I've yet to meet an Ethiopian that believes in the U.S. at this point. Like, and that kind of goes to this other question. And do you think that the U.S., especially media, has been so heavy-handed against the Ethiopian government because of its relationships with China? I mean, like you said, the TPLF had a relationship with China also. I mean, so
to give you a sense among the local Ethiopians, literally here in D.C., and I'll hand it back to you, Jamarl, because I know you were going with this
there's another
question,
major protest,
but just framing this in terms of the facts locally. There was a protest by Ethiopians in front of the White House. A lot of people came out. No local news coverage. No outside cameras from MSNBC, CNN, Fox, whatever, BBC. And yet, if you look around, and it makes sense, a lot of the signs, pretty much most of the signs, were like, fake news, BBC, stop lying about Ethiopia. Exactly. People were incredibly critical of news coverage. So, Jamarl, I know you're going somewhere, but Carl, that's sort of the...
Yeah, it's kind of that part, right? I mean, considering China had a relationship with both, but is it just one of those things that the U.S. believes that the Abiy Ahmed government will be less likely to kind of, let's say, increase its relationship with the U.S. as compared to the TPLF, which at this point seems like it would owe the U.S. if it indeed continues with the sanctions and continue to find ways to undermine the government. And this clearly is going to improve the relationship between Ethiopia and China, correct?
I mean, if you look at the media coverage, it is I agree, it's very suspicious. After the Foreign Policy article about why Ethiopia should trust the West, you have a Bloomberg opinion article by the former General James Starvis, who I think he was a top NATO commander. And the title was Ethiopia's Civil War is a Problem U.S. Troops Can Help Solve. I mean, these guys just love to insert U.S. everywhere. I think U.S. is more... I would say U.S. is very opportunistic. I think they saw the ethnic conflict and the Civil War as an opportunity to insert U.S. troops presence in Ethiopia, because Ethiopia is a very important country in the Horn of Africa. It hosts the African Union in its capital. So it's a very important country. I think U.S. definitely sees the Civil War as a way to expand its own footprint in Ethiopia, and maybe they see possibly at expense of China. But I don't think that will actually work out, because China don't necessarily see everything as black and white. They will work with whoever is in power. It's only U.S. We are always see the world as some kind of Manichaean struggle between the light and the darkness. There's always like one good side, one the bad side, right? This is my take. My take is U.S. is just being opportunistic, trying to insert more military presence at the Horn of Africa because it's a very strategic region.
Very cool. Carl, thank you, my man. Always appreciate these conversations. And I think I agree with you with the opportunistic thing. I think my concern is that dictatorships are easier to deal with because you have basically one power source, as opposed to democracies, which are a little bit more messy. And whereas China is willing to work with either, well, it seems that the TPLF is going to give or offer something to the U.S. in this case if they get back in power. And some of that may be leverage in association with China on this. That was my thinking about it. That's why I was asking the question in that way. Carl, thank you very much. You guys are listening to Fault Lines. Carl Jha is host of Silk and Steel podcast, focused on China and surrounding regions and their history, culture, and politics. You can follow him at Carl Jha on Twitter and follow his podcast, Silk In, and subscribe and support his podcast at patreon.com, Silk and Steel. You guys are listening to Fault Lines. Thomas and Stranahan back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever-vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the radically independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That would mean you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Right on. Shout out to Carl Shaw. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's get into the headlines, though. We always have a few. Oh, by the way, one of the main headlines, we're not going to be here on Thursday and Friday. It's going to be Thanksgiving, and we're taking those 2 days off. However, we will be here bright and early on the Monday following that week. But for your headlines in the news, yesterday in the United States, there were 31,372 new COVID cases reported, along with 126 new deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of 93,689 cases per day, an increase of 29% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 59% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 69% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 47,692,614 people across the United States and has killed an unfortunate 769,769 men, women, and children in this country. Again, I always point out on Mondays, the 126 deaths, the number's probably too low. For whatever reason, I'm not quite sure what goes on over the weekend in regards to the tracking, but it seems to be low on Monday and then builds up over the course of the week. We'll see. We'll know tomorrow. In national news, 5 people were killed and more than 40 injured when a vehicle drove into a Christmas parade Sunday afternoon in Waukesha, Wisconsin, city officials said. Witnesses described the horror of seeing individuals struck and laying on the ground after a red SUV drove through a series of barricades and barreled into a crowded parade route on Main Street around 4:39 p.m. local time. Horrendous. Michael Cohen is about to be a free man. Monday morning, Donald Trump's former personal attorney and self-described fixer will be officially released from his 3-year prison sentence, the past year plus of it served from the posh Parker Avenue apartment. Kyle Rittenhouse, the teenager who was acquitted of murder last week after shooting and killing 2 people in Kenosha, Wisconsin during civil unrest there last year, said he supports Black Lives Matter movement. Quote, "I'm not a racist person. I support BLM," unquote, Rittenhouse said during an interview with Fox News' Tucker Carlson. That's supposed to play tonight, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. In international news, Austria on Monday became the first nation in the European Union to go into full lockdown this autumn. The 20-day national lockdown came into force at midnight, meaning all people, vaccinated or not, can only leave their homes for essential reasons such as food, work, and school. Non-essential shops are closed. The lockdown will be reviewed after an initial 10 days as per law. Also, one of the interesting stories here, Germany is talking about a vaccine mandate. That was one of the things that was bubbling up. As we know, as we were speaking to Peter last week, COVID has basically run amok again. 4th wave in Europe at this point. And many of those nations are trying to find ways to deal with it. Lockdowns, vaccinations, mandates, government policy, etc. And you've had massive, massive protests already as a result of it. Stay tuned.
Yeah. Oh, and on that, Austria last week, we were speaking
Huge
with Peter.
protests, yeah.
But Austria went ahead with vaccine mandates.
Mm-hmm.
They at least set themselves up for it. I believe it's February 1st of this coming year that those will actually be in effect. But they were the first country in the EU to
do it,
have that full mandate requirement. And then the German government, specifically the current acting German government and Angela Merkel's German government, it's the CDU-CSU bloc that's talking about vaccine mandates right now. But again, who knows how long they'll be in power? In a couple of months, they could be out. We'll see.
Yeah, basically linked up PM at this point in the government.
Yeah.
Let's keep going. Tens of thousands of people marched in Belgium and Netherlands in sometimes violent protests over the last 3 nights, protesting against reinforced COVID-19 restrictions. Didn't you say they had LGBT flags and right-wing flags? Something
it was like white. Yeah, it was, one of the articles, I could find the outlet even that I got this coverage from, but I was referencing an article, The Guardian, who was saying they saw Signs among the crowd varied from far-right insignia to the rainbow flags of the LGBT community. Quote, end quote. So there you go.
It's like bringing people, like this horseshoe thing where people are coming together raising their hands. It's like, we're for gay rights, we're for white power, we hate COVID.
We hate COVID, we hate these restrictions, these stupid restrictions. Just let us be outside so we can hate each other in the streets.
That's
again
hilarious. I love that.
I think that was more a thing in the U.S. than in the EU. Although they do that too. I just know that last summer it got real heated here.
Yeah.
But
who knew that people of different stripes can't get together? Let's keep going. Almost as abruptly as she vanished, Chinese tennis star Peng Shuai reappeared in public view over the weekend on a Sunday video call between Peng and International Olympic Committee President Thomas Bach. The three-time Olympian insisted she is, quote, safe and well, living at her home in Beijing, unquote, and would like to have her privacy respected, according to a statement from the IOC. We have another post. This one is from Kristen Gillibrand herself. She says, quote, burying our heads in the sand is neither a strategy nor an acceptable approach. That's why I've introduced bipartisan proposal to provide oversight and accountability over reports of unidentified aerial phenomena, unquote. Senator Gillibrand is the one who basically put in a new provision into the NDAA that's passed this House, I believe, is going to the Senate, at which point it may be signed by one Joe Biden, basically changing our world around us. And last story, Sudanese President Abdallah Hamdok will be restored to his office on Sunday, weeks after he was ousted by the military. Two sources from the dissolved government said. The sources asked for anonymity as they're not authorized to talk to the media, confirmed that a deal was brokered between Sudanese mediation team, including politicians, academics, clerics, and other figures. They said head of the Sudan's ruling council, Abdul Fattah al-Burhan, and Hamdok met on Saturday night and agreed to return the ousted prime minister and release all detainees. This is very interesting. We're going to get into this with Mark Sloboda, just figuring out what took place. They basically took power, and now they're giving it back. In holiday news, we have Go for a Ride Day and Love Your Freckles Day. Love Yourself Day. I love that. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yeah, I love that. Love Your Freckles Day. It's like, freckles and all. I can dig that. Good body image. So Michael Cohen is about to be a free man. Michael Cohen, think about that. I mean, this feels so ancient history, and yet it was only a few years ago. One of the things I want to point out, though, is that if you remember, Michael Cohen flipped on Donald Trump, meaning Trump didn't give him a pardon or anything like that. He gets subjected to all sorts of persecution, just like Roger Stone and just like some of the other people in Trump's orbit. None of the stuff having anything to do with Russiagate, and yet they would bring up those people being prosecuted as having something to do with Russiagate. In Michael Cohen's case, though, Cohen came to Jesus during investigation and basically went after Trump on this. I mean, he basically said, he is pushed Trump away.
Came to Jesus.
I couldn't think of the other anything else to call it. But
went to the devil's. Oh, no, I'm just kidding.
And by the way, I don't mean Jesus in this one is good or bad. Just meaning he saw some light.
I completely. I'm not
straight in the direction. But the interesting thing I want to point out, regardless of him kind of giving up Trump on that, he still held up to the point of saying, look, there's nothing to the Trump and Russia stuff. Meaning the stuff that you guys are trying to say happened, didn't happen. And if Cohen...
They didn't really listen to that part. They didn't repeat that part too loudly when they were talking about everything he had to say.
They didn't at all. And that's kind of the point that I wanted to make. Despite him turning over Donald Trump and basically putting a knife in him, he still wouldn't go that far. And they still didn't care about the fact that he wouldn't go that far, despite turning over on Trump. Just want to point that out. He's going to be a free man. He went after Trump. He didn't put a knife in Trump on the whole Russiagate stuff because he's making the point that the Russiagate stuff wasn't real. And the fact that he basically changed his leaf or turned a new leaf should have given them a heads up that he would have been willing to give that information if there was anything to give on that information front. At least that's my thought.
Kind of reminds me of Comey. Mm-hmm. And not just because their first names like share 3 letters, but they both did a weird, I don't know, they both just played weird, sort of ambiguous roles in some ways. Cohen less so, but Comey with like verifying the problems with the Clinton emails, but like not pursuing them.
Very weird stuff.
Throwing that massive spanner in the works. It's such a crucial time during the election back in 2016.
Mm-hmm. And then she also, what did he do also? He said, oh, we have new information. We need to do our emails again.
Yep.
So that comes up within like a few weeks of the election.
Yep.
And then they got mad at him for it.
Of
it's
course.
like, how are you getting mad at Comey for that? Well, nobody told her to be duplicitous.
Because he came out and said it. And then it's like timed perfectly. But then it's like, it's not like he pursued it so strenuously as to actually damn her with it. When it was kind of damnable.
Yeah, it really was.
The media had been running cover for her as saying, this isn't a real thing effectively. And who are you, mocking the idea, mocking the people who were correctly going, hey, you have a secret email server. This is kind of shady and weird. And what are you potentially keeping a secret as you have a massive foundation that you raise money for with your husband that does sort of international work while you're Secretary of State, and you have this weird backline of who knows what you're doing? Who knows? Are you bringing in money? Are you making corrupt deals with foreign powers? I'm not even getting into the Epstein stuff.
That's a yes. I think that,
but yeah, that would be a yes,
slush
right?
fund of a thing that came out and the media just wouldn't touch it. Man, it's amazing to me how the level of protection that these guys have when you're on side of a particular faction. Hunter Biden stuff, they wouldn't even show that before the election, despite the fact that all of it was legit.
Well, it also, can we go back to the Peng Shuai thing for a second? Yeah. Admittedly, a little bit of a story, but there's something so interesting to me about this one. Think about the parallels with the U.S. The Hunter Biden story is
very similar.
Is one part of it.
Yeah.
Oh, man, there was somewhere that I was going. It's right on the tip of my tongue. But there are all these weird parallels with the Peng Shuai story and how the media treats us in this country. Think about Hunter Biden getting Secret Service protection while his dad, Joe Biden, isn't in the government. This is, as Trump's president, where Secret Service agents are sent out to investigate and recover like a gun, a laptop. There were a couple of different incidents that they were sent down because who was it who'd thrown the gun away? I think it was, he was dating his brother's widow, his sister-in-law, effectively. He was dating her. She had a gun of his. She was worried he would use it. She threw it in a random trash can, and Secret Service had to go investigate that. And, of course, Hunter apparently had pawned off his laptop to the store that the Secret Service had to go and investigate this stuff. Both of those events happening while Joe Biden was not near the White House, not in the administration. Yeah. So when I criticize Peng Shuai, or when I criticize on the Peng Shuai case, the Chinese government and Chinese censors for acting on behalf of a former vice premier to cover up a lot of this weird story, this weird sort of sexual assault, sexual
offer,
entanglement, sort of corruption, weird. And just salacious behavior or whatever that's unbecoming of a statesperson. Yeah. Not that we have much to talk about after Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton and everything else in the States, but still, the idea that when I'm hitting the Chinese state for censoring and getting involved in that, American state does the same damn thing.
And by the way, independent media, supposedly.
Yeah.
Meaning they're supposed to be separate and distinct from the White House while continuously protecting the White House.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that to be either an apologist for the Chinese government or anything like that. I guess my point is we both have problems. Both of our governments have pretty clear problems. Yeah. And I'm not here to do the measuring contest with them. No, but speaking with Carl, it's like having this conversation across what you'd expect to be a big bubble. We're on, our in-group is their out-group and vice versa or whatever. Expects us to be enemies. And it's like, no, actually, in some ways, we're kind of pretty similar. We have similar sets of problems. Our government is bungling things in different ways. Not 100% similar. Yeah. I'm not trying to make a false equivalence here, but I think you get where I'm going.
It's close. I mean, for these governments supposedly to be different, for the media space supposed to be different. I mean, the media space in China is supposed to be more of consensus and, this kind of under the auspices of the state. And yet they come to similar, let's say, behaviors. I mean, in the Hunter Biden thing, you had this just horrible scheme where they were covering the laptop, didn't necessarily want to put that out there. They acted as if New York Post story were wrong, which it wasn't. It was completely right. You had the AP, you even had Reuters basically saying we don't do BS stories. Come to find out, it wasn't a BS story. All of that stuff was true. And then it's like, but this is supposed to be separate media. This is not supposed to be affiliated or connected to the U.S. government. And in some way, the fact that it's not affiliated or connected with the U.S. government is supposed to give more cover when they actually do those reports. Because the thought is, well, these guys are independent and they're just telling us the truth about a particular situation. They're not associated with the U.S. government. Despite the fact that they're still coming to conclusions that are far in line with the U.S., whether it's Ethiopia, whether it's the Hunter Biden stuff. In your case, you're making a point about China saying, well, look, in the same way that the U.S. was covering for this, it seems like the censors were doing something similar in China, but it would make more sense in China considering the media is supposed to be under the thumb of the government of sorts. It doesn't supposed to make sense here, and yet
it's supposed to, where we have this idea that we have this completely independent media. It's au contraire, I would argue. I would argue that the subtlety and refinement with which the media attunes itself to the preferences of the ruling class far outdone in the West compared to China. China is an underdeveloped civilization when it comes to information in that sense. It's just, I'm not the oldest civilization on the face of this earth, folks. I'm not trying to make anything, beyond that. But in terms of managing information, we had like the Cold War, the Anglo-American establishment, the McCarthyite crisis, all this counter-espionage, Project Mockingbird stuff, and vast military and intelligence budgets. And I'm not alleging that everything is controlled. But my point is, when it comes to information warfare and psyops and using propaganda in the media, we have a few more decades, and I'm sure a few more hundreds of billions of dollars or whatever spent on it.
It's also more necessary in the United States.
Yeah, because of the whole democracy thing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
it's like the way you need to manipulate the public in order to keep it within certain guardrails, where you may not necessarily have that in the way that China operates. Now, I understood what you meant. You weren't trying to undermine China in regards to its longevity. It's more so it's just different governments. I mean, but I still would say, not knowing that the media is, let's say, taking its cues from leadership or rulership or whatever the main prevailing rulership is, on some level, it's supposed to give media that much more capability of being propagandistic, if that makes sense. It's like, if I don't know that you're giving me propaganda, then you have a much better chance of getting it over the finish line without me thinking it's propaganda. I may think that it's more legitimate or more real. And, it's shocking to see how it dovetails with just leadership thought. I mean, it really is. Let's do this. Let's take a break. We have our guest on the line. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the D.C. area or find yourself in the D.C. area, you can always catch us on radio Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. You can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with the chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Over the weekend, one of the big stories that was basically rattling around and people were having all sorts of back and forth on was this notion from American intelligence officials warning that that Russia could potentially attack the Ukraine or is preparing to attack the Ukraine in January or, in this case, February. And you have other members of the Ukrainian government basically backing up this particular line of logic. I'm always skeptical about stories like this. Yes, you do have maneuverings from Russian military on their own border, but you also have maneuverings from NATO having other military exercises and everything else. So let's get into the reality of this. What's the reality? To have a conversation, we're joined with Mark Sloboda. He's an international relations and security analyst. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Jamarl, Shane, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Fault Lines.
Thanks, my man. It's always an honor and a privilege to have you. So what's the reality of this? I'm always skeptical of stuff that I hear coming out of U.S. media on this front because they have a tendency to basically, let's say, not be honest, or at the very least bend whatever level of truth into a pretzel. And I don't get the feeling that Russia basically wants to attack or invade Ukraine, not to mention there was all sorts of provocations going back and forth on this particular issue. So what's the reality here? Is Russia gearing up for an attack on the Ukraine in January or February of next year?
Okay, so first of all, these sources through which the U.S. government is speaking to the media are always defined as sources or anonymous officials. So without any officials actually willing to put their name and identity on the line, there is a question of how reliable this latest intelligence assessment supposedly is. At the same time, we had the head of the Ukrainian Kiev regime's defense intelligence agency conducting an extensive article interview with Howard Altman in the U.S. Military Times. That supposedly he detailed a elaborate plan, including maps that were very detailed on where Russian military forces could be positioned to attack Ukraine, not necessarily where they are, but of course left out the positions of all Ukrainian and NATO forces in the region. There's a problem here because in the last month, we've heard repeated calls that Russia is building up forces on the Ukrainian border. Then there's always a question of, well, where are these forces that they're building up? I mean, they should be able to provide some even open source intelligence, some Google Maps, some more privately owned satellite information, even some visuals. And then it turns out that the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian state border self, and the Ukrainian president himself, Zelensky, have dismissed these rumors of Russian troop buildup on their border, saying it's no more than it has been for the last 7 years since the conflict first broke out. And Zelensky, I mean, what you could call a pro-U.S. President of the Kiev regime. In fact, the only, he wants more U.S. support, is that he called it Western media disinformation that Russia was conducting a buildup. But he's also swung back and forth on this. So all of the talk about where Russia is building up military forces seems to be in locations that are literally hundreds of kilometers from Ukraine, closer to Belarus, but not even close to Belarus. And this is a time of the year when Russia is traditionally conducting movements of military forces within its own borders, because that's what we're talking about here. All of this is concern over Russia moving forces significantly back from its own borders within its own country after the annual late summer fall military exercises which take place in the country. So there's a lot of questions about the reliability of this information. And while it is not impossible that Russia could conduct military operations, on its borders in the winter, it generally is stated that is a rather difficult, that raises the difficulty level of military operations such that most Western countries would never consider it.
Including Russia, I would think, learning a couple of things. Yeah. I mean, I'm reminded of like Napoleon's march on Moscow as the ultimate end of Napoleon and the whole going there in winter thing. Granted, that's invading Russia, not Russia invading another country, but the principle stands in a very close by geographically region of the world anyway. No, it seems silly. We were talking about this not too long ago. It was just last year, right? We were having these same conversations. Jamarl and I went back into it this morning. Yes. Why are we having these again? What's the timing? I mean, the NDAA has still not passed. They still don't have that defense spending bill through. It's usually passed earlier on in the year, and it's been over 50 years now since we failed to pass an NDAA. So maybe some people are starting to get worried. That's one adjunct explanation, but clearly that wouldn't explain the whole of it. Is there some more thought out strategic thought process here behind why this is happening now? And if so, what do you think it is, Mark?
There are things going on in the region, and you really, I think, for this need to look at more events that are happening in Ukraine itself, rather than say at the U.S. Budget for this. And the concern is over that in the last a couple of months, the Ukrainian president has shut down all of the media outlets representing Eastern Ukraine that are critical of his government. and supporting of the opposition bloc. He's imprisoned the head of the opposition bloc under politically motivated treason charges, because evidently just the idea of wanting a foreign policy for Ukraine that is not antagonistic to Russia is treason under the new regime. Ukraine has moved up forces to its own conflict borders within the country with the Donbass, with the breakaway province that has never acceded to the events of the 2014 U.S.-backed putsch, which overthrew the democratically elected government of Ukraine that was voted overwhelmingly in eastern Ukraine. They've increased the shelling. They have seized a small village within the gray zone that is overseen by the OSCE between the forces of the Kiev regime and the Donbass. And perhaps the biggest incident is they have conducted airstrike using a Turkish-bought military drone, the Bayraktar TB2, a combat drone that was used by Turkey and Turkey-backed forces in Azerbaijan, Libya, and in Syria. And of course, this is a violation of the Minsk Accords and a rather serious escalation. Certainly, the mood in Donbass is that if there is not if they do not make a counter reaction, then the regime in Kiev will keep military pressing them, because they will see that as a weakness and continue the path to try to ignore the Minsk Accords and pursue, the military conquest of Donbass and finally subjugate them to the events of the putsch that occurred in 2014. And voices in Russia are also saying that, Europe has, first of all, Kiev has long basically openly decried the Minsk Accords, saying that they cannot and will never fulfill them because it would politically challenge everything that has happened in the country since 2014. Russia pressed Germany and France. France and Germany wanted another meeting of the Normandy format. And Russia said, we haven't had any results from the last one. How about you press your client state in Kiev and get them to sit down with the leadership in the Donbass and begin political reconciliations, talking to each other, which is step one of the many steps of the Minsk Accords. And France and Germany evidently refused. They have no intention of pressing on this. Russia sees then that everything, we have had a long series of the West basically pulling out or completely ignoring agreements that are made with the Donbass, with Ukraine, starting with the January 21st agreement in 2014 and continuing on now through the Minsk II Accords, where they give lip service to it, but there hasn't been any steps taken to implement them by Ukraine, and we're looking at over 6 years now. And within the country, they never talk as if there's even a possibility that they will ever be fulfilled. And there are people in Russia saying that at this point, the only language that the West understands and that applies to its client state in Kiev is military force, and that they won't stop the military provocations against Donbass until Russia makes clear what its red lines are for protecting the civilian population of East Ukraine. And at the same time, we have the UK moving special forces into Poland on the Belarusian border, talking about sending some 600 special forces to Ukraine as well, which is definitely, a red line for Russia. The U.S. is, according to Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, the U.S. is going to move nuclear weapons into Eastern Europe. And that is just something that was announced in the last week. And Russia is extremely upset about that because, of course, it completely abrogates the NATO-Russia Founding Act, signed in the late 90s. Not that it has been paid any attention to for years. And the U.S. Congress has put forward a bill to not recognize
Vladimir Putin after 2024.
Vladimir Putin, if he's elected again as president of Russia.
Which is astonishing. My mouth hit the floor when I saw that. It's like somebody saying Joe Biden is not going to be president and we're going to pass this in our parliament. That's utter nonsense. The level of propagation for all of these things. And correct me if I'm wrong, there's supposed to be a Biden-Putin summit that's being negotiated to go forward either, I guess, towards the end of the year or next year. And like you said,
that's according to Russian sources.
Right, that's according to Russian sources. I guess there are two questions. Is it true on the first point? But on the second point, what are those red lines, and what does it look like when those red lines are breached?
Yeah, well, the first question is no one knows because only the Russian side has mentioned that it's even a possibility, and the U.S. hasn't talked about it at all. And that, of course, is not a good sign. So we'll leave that one into no one knows if and when it will ever happen again. As to your second question, that's more important because Putin has spoken very pointedly to exactly this. It has long established what its red lines are. Drawing Ukraine or Georgia into NATO. NATO troops in Ukraine. Permanent stationing of NATO troops in post-Soviet countries close to Russia's border, which is a violation of the NATO-Russia Founding Act and the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, which has already long, been done. And now the U.S. moving nuclear weapons into Europe, Eastern Europe. And that, of course, is another big red line. And Russia is left saying, well, with our red lines keep being ignored as if we don't have any legitimate national security interests, while the U.S. has legitimate interests supposedly all over the world, then we're going to have to take steps to ensure that those red lines are respected. And again, they have said, both the Russian president and the Russian foreign minister have made statements that the only language that the U.S. seems to respond to is military force. And that is not a good sign. But there is a lot of background tension building. And I don't see a Russian military buildup on the ground now. But there is certainly the potential for it happening in the next few months. It would be with the hoped intent to force the West, to force their client state regime in Kiev to start fulfilling the Minsk Accords and sit down with its people in East Ukraine and begin a political reconciliation with them instead of shelling them and attacking them with Turkish combat drones. But if that isn't followed through on, then Russia may have to consider more direct military support for the people of East Ukraine and the Donbass.
What do you expect this? Biden was notable, and we were talking about this months ago, obviously, for meeting with Putin face-to-face. We were also going to be talking about the second planned meeting between the two, but that would smack against the idea. It kind of cuts against the grain of what we were just talking about, which is the United States is planning, it seems, at least it might, not recognize Putin starting just a couple of years from now. So on the one hand, you have a somewhat notable attempt to resume relations and go into a détente with Putin on this stuff. On the other hand, there are elements that clearly want to keep that from happening and would like to continue to vilify Russia and effectively, it seems, treat them on this, on the same level as we're treating China as similar enemies. I thought that we were pivoting away from viewing Russia as enemies and prioritizing China.
I have not seen that at all. And I think we've talked about this before, that I did not expect anything from the previous Putin-Biden meeting. I don't think the U.S. policy has done anything but escalate since Russia. I mean, it is somewhat encouraging that Biden is willing to sit down with Russia, but apparently all he's doing when he's doing so is making threats and then following through on them. That is not a positive development. There has been no attempt by the Biden administration at détente. There has been talking, but it seems that the U.S. has done more talking to and not much listening. And Russia is starting to be nervous and be angry as a result of where the current situation is going. I mean,
sounds
moving
justified.
U.S. nuclear weapons into Eastern Europe and continuing provocative military drills on the other side of the world in the Black Sea, off Russia's coast in the Far East, supplying increasing amounts of weapons and ammunition to the regime in Kiev so that it can continue killing its own people in East Ukraine. None of these are positive developments.
None of those sound positive.
If that's the U.S.'s idea of détente, well, then we're in trouble.
Of course, but you see the appearance too. And so just briefly, do you think this is the Biden administration attempting to give to Western audiences the appearance that we're looking for a détente, but really they're just looking for more aggression, looking for escalation?
I think that there are people within the Biden administration that believe that it is better to talk to your opponent even when you are in a conflictual situation, because at least there is some communication ongoing. I don't think that Biden benefits at all domestically from sitting down with Putin. I don't think that there's any domestic audience in the U.S. demanding that or giving him approval for doing that.
It's very small, very, very small, but you can count us among them. Like.
Okay. But I mean, in political terms, it doesn't bring Biden any benefits. So there are other reasons. And one of them is probably just sounding Russian government officials out and, informing Russia of what its seemingly ever new red lines closer to Russia are.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's unfortunate because I do think there was an opportunity there that was basically missed. And, like you said, with everything that's going on, it seems like you were right. I mean, it's only been escalation since the last meeting, and it didn't necessarily seem to come to anything outside of just talking. I want to move slightly or pivot slightly to this weird case coming out of Sudan. So Sudanese Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok was restored to office on Sunday after he was basically ousted by the military. And supposedly sources are saying that there was some kind of agreement that was made between the military that was basically allow him to regain power. What is taking place in Sudan? I mean, you've just had basically the overthrow of the government with the military. Now the military is handing back power. What are they getting out of this kind of new arrangement?
Okay, well, you have to remember that there have been competing protests in Sudan for the last year between those in support of the civilian government led by Hamdok and in support and demanding that the military take power back in the country because of the economic chaos and what its critics have taken to calling the hunger government for the economic problems and starvation that have resulted from it starting to implement neoliberal IMF reforms that have been, dictated to it. The United States has, had a role in all of this. And it is extremely fearful of a increased Chinese influence in the country, or should we say a return to Chinese influence in the country. What it appears to be right now is a limited power sharing arrangement that is supposedly only supposed to work toward be a transitional government towards new elections, but that aren't supposed to take place now until 2023. So that's more than a year away at this point. And it seems that the Sudanese military couldn't find a civilian political figurehead that they thought could politically pacify the protesters that were in support of the Hamdok government. And we're talking about political forces in Sudan that have long been protesting against the military in the country. What may come out of this is that the protesters have continued to protest against the the military, even after the announcement that Hamdok is returning and has signed a deal with the military. The own political forces that back him are now calling him a traitor and siding with the military. And so that doesn't bode well politically for him, but there is the hope that at least that eventually the protests from that side could die down. The protests that were pro-military, that were blocking the primary port in the country, causing some further economic turmoil in the country, they have stopped. But part of the rationale for bringing Hamdok back, other than domestic political reasons, is the U.S. began economic measures against Sudan almost immediately after the military coup. And this may be an attempt to somewhat alleviate them and at least prevent any further U.S. sanctions against the country with bringing Hamdok back into the picture, even if as a figurehead transitional prime minister.
Okay, very cool. Wow, that's fascinating. I mean, just all of the things that are taking place. I'm curious from the standpoint of, I mean, Sudan is right there by Ethiopia. We were having a conversation earlier this morning with Carl Jha about Ethiopia and whether or not the U.S. influence and Western influence, and especially media and the way that the language and the line that's been taking place has to do with this kind of perceived relationship between China and Ethiopia. Basically, this notion that, well, China's willing to work with either the TPLF or the Abiy Ahmed government. But from the standpoint of dictatorships, it's far easier to engage with a dictatorship because one rule pretty much goes for the policy, whereas democracies can be a little bit more messy in regards to kind of that foreign influence. So is China the issue here? Like, meaning this kind of underlying thing with China and its association with Africa, is that what's underlying some of this conflict where the U.S. is getting more involved with Ethiopia?
Yeah, I believe with Ethiopia, if you're looking at why the United States is supporting the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which is ostensibly a left nationalist, ethno-nationalist grouping representing the Tigray people, but has a history of a past history of Marxist involvement. It's one of these weird post-Cold War twists, like the U.S. pivoting and supporting Kurdish groups like the YPG that were once allied, communists and supported with the Soviet Union. And in fact, a large number of the Kurds are still leftist of one form or another. But, it just shows that it all comes down really to geopolitics more than anything else. And the only reason why the U.S. would supporting the TPLF that anyone can figure is that they are trying to pressure the government of Ethiopia or hoping to overthrow it in order to limit Chinese influence in the country. And that is because the current leadership of Ethiopia has made inroads, to keeping a balanced foreign policy, accepting of Chinese investment, not antagonistic to Russia's somewhat more limited interests in Africa, and basically just not following the dictates and beginning to raise the specter of Pan-Africanism again, something that is a big no-no for the U.S. Even worse from the U.S. perspective, they have sought to reach out across to their arch enemy, Eritrea, and basically settle peace relations. So the odd situation now where Eritrean military forces are supporting the Ethiopian government against the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which have also allied with a revolutionary group in Eritrea itself. So we've got two insurrectionist groups in the country clasping hands together, while the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments clasping hands together. And that is a really odd political situation, considering, the harsh history between Ethiopia and Eritrea, going back quite some time historically.
Let's close this out. Mark, thank you for joining us. It was good talking with you this morning, as always.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being with us. Mark Sloboda is an international relations and security analyst. Follow him on Twitter at MarkSloboda1. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, coming back, and we'll be taking your calls for the next 15 minutes. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Again, 202-521-1320. We have Tarif on hold, and we have, I'm going to go to you right now, Tarif, but we've got room for more, of course. Again, 202-521-1320. Tarif, calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, what's on your mind?
Good morning, gentlemen. Thanks for taking my call. First, I'd like to say hashtag free drone science, free Donzer, and hands off Haiti. First comment, 3 comments. First comment is that also with the Ethiopian situation, Kenya and Rwanda presidents visited over the past 2 weeks Ethiopia to basically show support for them, which is a good thing. You know what I'm saying? So that's the message to the West that, other African nations are supporting Ethiopia. My second comment is dealing with the Joe Biden declaring that he's going to run for 2024.
Oh, he did declare it.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people mad at the DNC, especially the Clintons and the other fractions inside there. So I think it's the best for him to do to cover his flank by pardoning Julian Assange. That would give him some leverage over the others.
Oh, I don't know about that, my man. Democrats are howler monkeys on the Assange issue. But I, for some reason, something in me says I don't believe it. I don't know what it is. Something in me is like, no, there's no way he's going to run again. By the same token, I don't know who would run in his seat.
That's what he's saying.
Yeah, that's what he's saying. I mean, but this has been 1 year, just so I'm clear, 1 year of this administration. Now, go back and look at George Bush. Go back and look at Obama when they first started and then when they ended. Both of those guys had a head full of gray hair. Old, you can see the age and everything come, just falling off them at that point, just the lines etched in their face. And so what does that mean for Joe Biden, who in his first year barely seems like he's getting by? I was watching one of the other things where the reporters were basically saying, we want a press conference. Tell the president we want a press conference. Think about that. Well, then, first year, where this is supposed to be kind of your honeymoon period, you have to basically beg the president to talk to the press, and not in these kind of scripted town hall events, but an actual press conference. I mean, I just can't see him making it through 3 more years and then doing another 4 on this. What are your thoughts, Shane? Do you think you can do it, or you buy it, or you think this is just talk right now to kind of settle this conversation for the time being?
Very good thing. I don't know. A couple things. I like where you were going with I like where you're going right at the end there. He's just saying this maybe to be like, okay, I'm still in it. I'm not quitting. Even though I'm taking some hits, I'm not quitting. And that's
I need you guys to shut up about this talking, like I'm out of here, that type of stuff.
Yeah, and that's enough in line with the character of Biden that I could see his aides and staff being like, hey, you should say this to give people the idea that you're still in the race, you're still committed, something like that, as a show of morale. But another thing is maybe he actually is committed, and maybe that's where his mind is at, weirdly enough, or whatever, and he actually thinks he can do it. I like also Tarif's point, though, that I'm not sure that the DNC is very happy with the idea that he's going to run again, because frankly, he's been a terrible president. He was probably their best choice at the time from the horrible, horrible, horrible short list of choices they restricted themselves to.
Yeah.
And even then, I'm not sure. But it's interesting. It's interesting. We'll see what happens. We're taking your calls. 202-521-1320. Again, 202-521-1320 is the phone number.
Yeah, I'm just uber skeptical. It just seems like he's having such a difficult time. I mean, look, first year, president falls asleep in front of the nation. Not just the nation, the world. So much so that I believe it was Australia's thing. We're basically laughing at him saying, this is the president of the United States. So they had him like not being able to get words out, falling over the things that he was saying. In other cases, making these speeches where nobody knew what he was saying. I don't know how that looks in 4 years. I guess that's maybe why I recoil at the thought of Biden being able to carry the burden for that long. I would be shocked if he makes it through the 4 years. And I don't mean him, dropping dead or anything like that. But it doesn't seem like he has the physical prowess to make that work. And so I don't know what this looks like 4 years of a presidency. And then you have another 4, supposedly. I can't see it.
Teddy Roosevelt, let's just compare presidents for a second. Teddy Roosevelt literally rode bison and hunted dinosaurs with muskets. And Biden poops in his meeting with the Pope. This is how far we've come. No, but there is something about generational decline or something in our elite class. And we did have better leaders. And again, the rumor that Biden pooped in his meeting with the Pope.
The fact that the rumor exists in itself.
The rumor exists in itself is a pretty terrible display of where people think the president is. But there you go.
Well, fortunately, they went in to make sure there was no intestinal issues over the weekend.
Oh, yeah. They got the
Kamala Harris, who was president for like an hour.
On the same day, Kamala Harris, president for a few minutes there, becoming the first woman president and the least liked president in the history of America simultaneously. No, that's also fake news.
And see, that's the other thing, though. Like, who else, if not Biden, who? I have no idea who that person is. No idea. Because initially, in the last one, you said, okay, well, Sanders is definitely going to run. So at the very least, for the last 2 terms, you knew there's going to be this hard left and this kind of hard right contingent that is kind of fighting for the soul of the Democratic Party. Okay, fair enough. I don't believe Sanders is going to run again. Kamala Harris, I couldn't imagine her. I can imagine her trying to run, but do I imagine her having any kind of platform in order to make that work? No. I don't know how you're going to be at 28% and say the American public wants me to run. I don't see that. And so from the standpoint of Republican side, it seems like they have a much deeper bench as opposed to Democrats who, I got to be honest, I have no idea who could potentially take up the mantle and go with that will have a potential to win.
Real quick, and we've got Tarif back on the line. And again, 202-521-1320 if anybody else wants to join us. We have a confirmation that the dude in your chat room was actually Tay-Zonday, by the way.
Oh, was it?
So, yeah, I'm just going to send this out on air real quick, just because it's funny. It's kind of funny. Tay-Zonday, like this internet celebrity who I remember, of course, I saw him in your chat room and I was like, wait, is that the Tay? He's a meme celebrity because back in the earlier days of YouTube, he came out with this song, Chocolate Rain. You might remember Chocolate Rain with this he has a good voice. Yeah. He has a good voice. But it's like this over-delivery, incredible over-delivery on this video, classic video. Anyway, he was in your chat room commenting. He sent a single comment earlier today. And it wasn't just some dude with like the Tay-Zonday handle. It was like the official Tay-Zonday with the gray background to the label and YouTube's little check mark confirming that it's actually the person. The guy has over 1 million followers on YouTube. He just came in for a second. It was funny.
Welcome to the show, my man.
Yeah.
Welcome to the show. That's the first time I think I've seen him, or you've seen him on there. So yeah, welcome to the show. We always appreciate our new subscribers.
It's just interesting. Let's go to Tarif, calling in from New Orleans. Again, 202-521-1320. Tarif, I hear you had something else to say. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I had 3 comments. The first is very important too, like the others. The last comment is very important. The Kennedy assassination film dealing with JFK Revisited. Everybody need to go check that out. Revisited through the looking glass. I saw it over the weekend. Had to order Showtime to watch it. Most people don't know that the weapon that Lee Harvey Oswald ordered was actually longer or shorter than, I might be having this backwards, was longer than the weapon that was used at the Dealey Plaza. Because the one they got at the Dealey Plaza was like 4.5 inches shorter than the one he used. Then on top of that, the straps for the handle when you for the weapon that you sling over your shoulder, his straps was at the bottom. The weapon that was used at Dealey Plaza was on the side of the hand grip and also the butt of the rifle. And some other weird things in that.
I need to watch it.
Well, the magical bullet is also weird.
Back into the left. Wait, why?
Yeah. It's like stops him in air and then hits the other guy.
You weren't here on this day, but Tyler Nixon, when there was one day that you were out, you were sick briefly. I talked to Tyler Nixon, and he kept highlighting, there was a book that he recommended, who's the author of which I forget. Basically, all of the reports of the medical professionals as they were conveying Kennedy's body from the site in Dallas to the hospital where he was ultimately, declared dead. All of the medical professionals who, from what Tyler was saying, from what this book was saying, 201 reported contrary injuries to what you'd expect from the official explanation. Like, it didn't make sense. It was coming out the other side. The way the bullet was going didn't make sense. So, Tarif, Oliver Stone, the director of the original JFK, sort of revolutionary hypothetical scenario of how the Kennedy assassination went down. As Oliver Stone's put it, he's not saying this is a true version. This is a sort of his, one interpretation of what happened, one of the main strands of interpretation. Anyway, Oliver Stone releasing this follow-up movie, which I need to go back and watch JFK. I want to watch this one too. Tarif, I hear you had other things to say too. What else were you getting to?
Along with that thing, along with the JFK assassination, it seemed like they messed up the art charts was so bad. If one was to go and look at JFK body, resume it again, then you can use that to log in more evidence. Well, the shots was in his back. He had a shot in his neck, the head. In his head, that came from the forward spot. So if you go and examine a body, you can find out if something was done to it to mislead the photographs of to give a certain type of image that the deep state wanted. But if you take a look at it, see if anybody messing with it afterwards.
Yeah.
See what I'm saying? That you can find out that manipulation was
blood or surgery or whatever they'd have to do to make it look like the bullet was coming from the opposite direction. That's grisly, but I hear what you're saying. Tarif, we have another caller. So what's your last point here?
Free Julian Science. That's it.
I hear you. As always, Tarif, thank you for the call. Tony, calling in from Austin. You're on the line, Tony. What's on your mind?
Hey, guys. Yeah, I was watching his Rittenhouse trial, and I saw some memes comparing it to, at the same time, there's Ghislaine Maxwell.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they would say, it's a conspiracy. They're making us look over here when the real thing's over here.
I've seen those same memes.
But it's a federal court thing. I guess they have different rules, no cameras. But wouldn't it be cool if they had a camera in the federal courts?
Yeah, and that's the thing, Tony, is that people will be like, well, but it's federal court and they don't record. And then people are like, well, why don't we do that? Why don't we make at least more of these courts? Not all of them, but why don't we make more of these trials transparent on the federal level? There's probably stuff we could learn about those. And then me looking at that, I'm like, okay, that's a valid argument. I'm sure there's some holes in it. I'm sure, you don't want every trial literally broadcast live. There are problems with it. But this seems like one that a lot of people would be interested in, and not just interested in, but like, I don't know, seems relevant, seems important, seems like that's the kind of thing we should be able to watch. Yeah. Valid points, in my opinion.
It always annoys me that Epstein was allowed to either off himself or help being offed.
He shouldn't have got off that easy.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, you committed those crimes in physical matter reality, buddy. I don't want him,
zipping away to some afterlife.
Yeah, that's right.
Whatever.
He's in prison over that. Not to mention on the stand, giving testimony. That's what I wanted. And so it's like Ghislaine Maxwell. It's not, it's a lesser thing,
So, Tony,
and we don't even know the amount of information she has at her disposal.
Sorry, Jamarl. I'm looking at the time. Tony, we've got to close out here, but I think you're a first-time caller. Any last, in maybe 10 seconds, any last comments here?
No, that's great. Great show, guys. That would be must-see TV to watch the trial of Jeffrey Epstein.
Oh, man, agreed.
Who knows?
But even Ghislaine Maxwell. That's also pretty darn primetime TV, of course. And, agreed on both counts. Tony, thank you for the call. I appreciate it. We're going to be closing this hour out in preparation for coming back in just a minute for the last hour this morning. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will return on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the Independent Corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I'm your ever-vigilant, your last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, you're listening to us, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Every time it's a little bit different. And sometimes it goes wrong, but I kind of like it overall. That's why I do it. Even though it's a little bit weird. But everybody, thank you for joining us. Quick heads up, of course, as we head into headlines, we're going to be off this Thursday and Friday. Thursday's Thanksgiving's Day. Thanksgiving. We're going to be taking Friday off just to make it a full 4-day weekend. And you get your heads up now. I'll be giving you reminders throughout the week. But of course, we'll be back next week on Monday as usual. Without further ado, let's get into our headlines. First up in COVID news, COVID stats. Yesterday in the United States, there were 31,372 new COVID cases reported. There were also 126 new deaths reported. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 93,689 cases per day. That's an increase of 29% from the average 2 weeks ago. 59% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. 69% of residents in the United States have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. And to give you the total numbers, the coronavirus has infected 47,692,614 people. And this number I'm about to read is correct. I just double-checked it. Total number of deaths so far from COVID-19 is 769,769 people.
800,000. I thought we were going to hit 800,000 before the end of the year.
It's a lot of deaths. My point was 769,769. That's what the number is. Is two repeating triple-digit strings or whatever. I don't know. It's just weird. But what's under the grisly reality there is that almost 770,000 people have died from COVID-19, according to these stats. In national political news here in the United States, American President Joe Biden reportedly told colleagues that he would be running for president again in 2024. We were just talking about that a couple minutes ago with Tarif and between Jamarl and I. Continuing on, 5 people were killed and more than 40 were injured when a vehicle drove into a Christmas parade Sunday afternoon in Waukesha, Wisconsin. Witnesses described the horror of seeing individuals struck and lying on the ground after a red SUV drove through a series of barricades and barreled into the crowded parade route that was on Main Street around 4:39 p.m. local time. And Jamarl, from what you were telling me, this morning it's come out that he was fleeing the site of another crime scene.
Yeah, that's what the report said. Let me see. I need to find the report. But it says something to the effect of he was fleeing from somewhere else when he ran into these guys.
And which would explain the flight, why he was going so fast or why they were going so fast.
Because he went through multiple barricades and everything in order to do that. Yeah.
Yep. Michael Cohen is about to be a free man. Monday morning, Donald Trump's former personal attorney and self-described fixer will officially be released from his 3-year prison sentence. The past year plus of it served from his posh Park Avenue apartment over in Manhattan. Kyle Rittenhouse, the teenager who was acquitted of murder last week after shooting and killing 2 people in Kenosha, Wisconsin during civil unrest there last year, said he supports the Black Lives Matter movement. He said, quote, "I'm not a racist person. I support the BLM movement," end quote. That was during an interview with Fox News host Tucker Carlson that preview aired last night. The full interview will be later on today. In international news, Austria on Monday became the first nation in the European Union to go into full lockdown this autumn. The 20-day national lockdown came into force at midnight last night, meaning that all people, vaccinated or not, can only leave their homes for essential reasons such as food, work, and school. Non-essential shops are closed. The lockdown will be reviewed after an initial 10 days. That's according to law. Tens of thousands of people marched in Belgium and the Netherlands, meanwhile. Those are in sometimes violent protests taking place over the last 3 nights, protesting against reinforced COVID-19 restrictions in those countries. But, you know, the anti-COVID, the COVID skeptic protest or whatever, big in Europe.
Yeah.
And people, I think, justifiably have been like, man, if you look at the size of these protests and the amount of media coverage they're getting, there's something intentional about it.
Yeah.
Like the media not covering them fully.
Yeah.
Which makes sense.
And their heads is probably the more you cover it, the more people that would join the protest, basically given
because you're normalizing it. You're giving them a platform.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. I'm pointing it out. You know? But that's I'm sure the why they don't do it. It's still worth pointing out that they're not doing it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because then it's like, wait, this big protest on my street. Why is nobody covering this?
Why ignoring that?
Why am I not hearing about it? It's like I'm hearing random stuff about in other nations, and yet this thing in my backyard, you think they'd be talking about it. And that's the kind of, I don't know, disillusionment that tends to win people over to the protesters' side.
Those protests are only going to get worse.
Yes. Almost as abruptly as she had vanished, Chinese tennis star Peng Shuai reappeared in public view over the weekend. On a Sunday video call between Peng and International Olympic Committee President Thomas Bach, the three-time Olympian insisted she is, quote, safe and well, living at her home in Beijing, end quote, and, quote, would like to have her privacy respected, end quote. That's according to a statement from the IOC, International Olympic Committee. This is after Peng Shuai had made accusations against the former vice premier of China, accusing him of sexual assault. We had a great conversation with Carl Jha earlier this morning. You can go back and hear it for about 15-20 minutes. We talk about this case, starting at 7:30 Eastern Time, and he gives a great explanation. I will quickly direct, if you want to learn more about this, if you've kind of been following, you can read for yourself, if you haven't already, the letter that started this out. He pointed us to a Reddit translation of her original letter, sort of making the accusation against the former vice premier. You can just search for that by searching for her name, also Reddit translation. You throw that in. That letter, translated into English, very readable. It gives you a lot more details about what actually is going on here. Turns out sexual assault, as is often the case, it's more complicated than that. They'd had like this pre-existing long-term romantic relationship. He was clearly very manipulative. And there's this one incident in particular where basically it seems she was coerced over the course of an evening. A common story. Into like, okay, then they're having sex, but she regrets it. And there's this feeling that he's trying to get her into the mindset to have sex, you know, and not just seducing her, but like telling her he hates her, that he's thought about her regularly over the past however many years, that kind of thing. I'm paraphrasing it slightly, but my point is, if you read that letter, that sets up, okay, what actually happened? What is her specific complaints about? Not just sexual assault as a two-word phrase, but what specifically is her pattern with him? Because elsewhere in that article, elsewhere in the letter, she describes how the years that she spent with him were some of the greatest in her life, and all the time they spent talking about chess and how much he taught her about economics and geopolitics. And the point is, she has all those feelings too.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's not one way.
It's not supposed to mitigate any manipulative or violent behavior. I don't want to allege something specific, but if he got that way, it's not going to mitigate it, but it tells the fuller story.
Also, Carl made the point that his wife knew.
Yes.
Which even gets a little bit weirder.
And that part of what broke down the relationship is that they had been in a relationship before. He became vice premier. He cut the relationship off. Then he, restarted it basically after he was out of the office. It seems like his wife was aware of it, because one of the big things that broke the camel's back, one of the straws eventually, was his wife, the former vice premier's wife, making strange comments to this tennis star while she's around at their house.
Yeah.
And so it seems like there was this open relationship environment. There's Carl brought up early on in the letter. I've spent too long on this for our mid-headlines conversation. My point is, there's a lot more you can go check out for yourself that I didn't know. And to finish out our headlines, in holiday news, today is National Cranberry Relish Day and National Sovereignty Day, Argentina. Interesting. Those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
So just to be clear, on the Waukesha, Wisconsin, it says investigators are examining whether the SUV's driver may have been fleeing another crime scene when he crashed into the parade goers. Law enforcement official briefed on the matter told Associated Press. The investigators are questioning the person in custody about the incident, which the official described as altercation involving a knife. So I guess they're still investigating whether it's true, but apparently there was some other altercation involving a knife, and they're questioning whether or not this SUV driver was basically fleeing the scene. We don't know yet.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, that story that Carl Jha was giving was very wild. I mean, that's some movie night stuff, some Lifetime movie stuff, all the way down to, well, maybe they killed her and started sending off fake messages after they all that stuff. It just gets so Tom Clancy-esque or Lifetime. One more thing. There's a story that just came up on Newsweek. This came out 11/15/2021. Opinion: it's time for Black America to break up with the Democratic Party. Man, applause.
It was a week ago.
It was a week ago.
But
I'm still giving it applause, even late applause.
I hear you.
I mean, look, it's like if you are giving 90% of your support to a political party. And with that support, you have nothing in return other than it'll keep a Republican out of office. Then what is that going to do to your ability to have hand and leverage in a political party that you devote that much emphasis on? And what happens when you start losing those people? I would make the point, if the Democratic Party loses African-American vote, even if it loses by 15%, they cease to be a party, or at the very least cease to be a viable party.
But here's the thing, man. What about, I'm playing sort of devil's advocate here, but I'll also kind of not, I don't know. Candace Owens, I'll bring her up for a second. When she makes these controversial statements about how the Democrats, what is it, she and Kanye, it's just a plantation, that kind of thing. They got
Right.
you on the Democratic plantation. Those are super controversial.
Yeah.
And she's seen as like, I don't even know what the right phrase or idea would be, but she's seen as a sort of turncoat or something like this. So it comes across weird.
Yeah.
But what you just said, also perfectly valid. What's the boundary
difference
between the
those
two? What's the
things?
difference between the two?
Because it doesn't jump to me to go to immediately say, okay, she vote Republican. And it seems like
That's where she goes.
Yeah, her main thrust is the Democratic Party is this, but Republicans are the party for whatever. And she's willing to basically say whatever she needs to say to make that argument.
But isn't that a sort of just procedural distinction? Like, I'll put it like this. That's just, okay, whether you think the third party, the new third party is the right move, or just got to fit within the two-party system. It's pragmatic. You got to switch to the other side so that we're not co-opted by this one side anymore. And I'm not speaking...
Or withhold your vote.
Or withhold your vote, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the vote in and of, not voting is weirdly enough in and of itself somewhat of a vote. And I'm not one of those people who basically like the not voting part, but it is part of the process.
I guess my point with Candace is that there's this weird moral layer to judging the things that she's saying as if she is herself racist for saying them.
Yeah.
When if you look at what she's practically saying, it's like, I get that it's provocative, but I think I don't know, maybe you don't see where, do you see where I'm going with that?
I think I know what you're saying. So it goes to the Black Republican thing. The Black Republican thing is so odd. I mean, when you have, 90% of African Americans that basically vote Democrat, then you have that 10% or less than that 10% that basically vote Republican. Well, you're left, at least what it comes across as, is if you're basically being a sycophant to this other party that in no way has had your best interest in mind for God knows how long. It feels that's where the turncoat or the traitor stuff comes into play. It's the way Black Republicans are basically perceived by the African American community. So I do get it in that sense. My thing, and I think it's perfectly fine and reasonable to kind of make the point of saying, what have you gotten out of this relationship for all of these years? And has this relationship served you? And not just served you, has it served you in the way that you've been engaging it? Meaning to have so much influence in a political party to the tune of voting 90%, however, having so little influence on what that party does. I mean, you can look at one issue after the next, whether it's college loans, whether it's inequality, whether it's health care, whether it's child care, down the list or down the line. And you ask yourself, okay, yes, these things are lefty policies, but let's say reparations is off the table. Will the people at the bottom end of the economic spectrum benefit from these policy proposals? Well, the answer is yes. Will the Democrat give you those? The answer is no. The answer is no. And so it becomes so why do you have that much influence if you have no influence? Or how do you have that much of a voting when you have no leverage or no influence within the context of the party itself? I mean, even if you stopped participating, that's still weight, if that makes sense. Even if it's not, okay, well, I'm going to vote for this Republican or whatever, just not participating creates a situation where Democrats can't win. I give you my wife's husband, my wife's dad. Right, that would be me. Right. My wife's dad, her and I were getting into this conversation. This was years ago. And I was like, yeah, man, you got to get to the point where you have to stop voting for these guys. If they're not representing your interests, stop putting your vote for them. He says, look, I can't vote for a Republican. I said, well, look, I'm not telling you to vote for a Republican. Her dad is a bit racist. But not just a bit, pretty racist, actually. He's like, I can't vote to a Republican. The stuff that they did in the 60s and the 70s and 80s and everything else, I can't have it. I can't do it. Do you know, 3 years after that conversation, he's like, I'm never voting for another Democrat again. Really? Even him. Wait,
real quick, I want to who's he racist against?
So it kind of runs the gambit. Him and I have gotten into conversations where we have not done all that well. The LGBTQ community being one. I know that's not race, that's sex. Whites, that's another part. Certain delusions associated with that stuff.
But you can't be racist against white people.
I know people say that. It depends on what you call racism versus prejudice, etc.
It does, and I'm just poking the hornet's nest there.
But he is a rough personality, to put it mildly. And him and I got, his Him and I don't get along all that well, but I don't think he gets along with too many people all that well.
Yeah.
And so much so there was a lot of.
And your point is, even he pivoted over at a certain place. Like, I'm not. This is just
even
ridiculous.
him. He was like, I'm done. He's just flat out, I'm done. These guys are going to act that way and they're going to function this way. They're not going to get my vote. If you have more people saying that, think about what that does to the political party. It puts more pressure on that party to basically live up to the things that it says or not. And until African Americans get to the point where they're like, all right, man, I'm done. You're not going to continue. Because honestly, it's a fear-based reason for voting. Oftentimes, it would be like I said, Republican wasn't even on the table in regards to a person to vote for. It was always just Democrat. Didn't matter who the Democrat was. It was just automatic with the thought of, we got to keep the monsters at bay. The monsters being, in this case, the Republican Party as it gets in office. That has to change. And at some point, and I don't mean it has to change in the sense of basically giving your vote to the Republicans. Not that, but it has to change where you are not just a perfunctory vote, where it's understood that, okay, this vote has certain requirements associated with it. And if these requirements don't take place, then you're no longer going to get this particular vote or this particular demographic, and you're going to have to win. However you win, it's going to be without us. Man. And by the way, Republicans are making gains in a sense. If you remember Donald Trump was able to get his share of the black vote.
Still small numbers. Yeah. Still small numbers, but yeah, he was getting more.
Yeah. His vote jumped. Youngkin, apparently his vote jumped.
Oh, and I remember people scoffing. I remember people scoffing last year about the idea that Trump could get more of the black vote in. We had plenty of left-wing guests on, and I guess, hindsight is 20/20, but I remember the idea being made fun of, and now in Newsweek, not exactly the most left-leaning outlet or the most right, I don't know. So I guess slightly right-leaning or something like that. I don't even know where
I don't know what Newsweek is. I think they kind of float.
But yeah, they kind of can float like that. But still, them publishing this article is significant.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see this. Well, and on this case, we should go into our break because we have Ted Rall on the line. But of course, he thinks about this stuff. We'll be talking about related factors. There's almost like this Schrodinger's benefit. And I still am looking for the right phrase. But it's a general model or general set of phenomena where I'll use this example because we're talking about it, but I feel like it applies in so many different spaces. It's easy to make arguments for and against black people, by and large, unanimously supporting the Democrat Party. For black people, you can make arguments saying, okay, the Republicans clearly haven't done anything to win you over, by and large. If you look at who's said the most and even done something on it, it's been Democrats. That kind of, you can make arguments for it, you can make arguments against it. Yeah. In terms of an impartial observer trying to figure out, okay, who should I listen to here? There's like this Overton's window thing of space for each side to make its point. And then I would argue that adds an ambiguity. You don't know going into it, okay, who am I supposed to support? What's right, what's wrong? Yeah. But it's interesting to see as the Overton window shifts on certain issues, and this is, I think, very clearly one of them. Okay, black Americans deciding not to go in thoughtlessly for Democrats just out of habit, but instead questioning that decision. There's been this space for people to make arguments for and against it, and it's interesting to see the Overton window shifting. And there's this sort of, I don't know, it's that strategic ambiguity thing where nobody knows exactly what the actual situation is in there, in the sense of, okay, you don't know what the particle is. You don't know if it's a particle or a wave until you measure it, until there's some decisive political event that shows, despite all the ambiguities, actually it always was this way. Actually, there is a big shift here. There's that same kind of thing, and it shows up in war and geopolitics, in politics and culture, all these different spaces. I see it here.
Agreed. Yeah, totally. Because this wasn't a conversation people were having 10 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
It just wasn't. I mean, it was almost just a given. But let's do this. We have Ted Rall on the line. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to be back with Ted Rall talking about Biden's Build Back Better, if it's going to be any better at all going into the Senate. And we have the Rittenhouse case. We're going to have a conversation with Ted about that. So you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
When the going gets tough, the powerful want propaganda. But we won't let them cancel the facts. Whether you're woke or drowsy, we know that you can handle the truth, and we're giving it to you every morning. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Your first stop for sanity in a world gone mad.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area or just so happen to find yourself in the area, Washington, D.C. area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So it has happened. Infrastructure Week, as Biden calls it. You had the bipartisan infrastructure bill pass. Okay, that's great. Small applause. And now the Build Back Better is now past the House and is going to the Senate. Now, its life is questionable in the Senate, and it's unclear or whether or not that's going to be able to get through the Senate, for one, or if it's going to be able to get through the Senate unscathed. And keep in mind, anything that takes place in the Senate that will make changes to this particular bill are going to have to go back into the House, where the House is going to have to agree to pass the bill. At this point, the bipartisan legislation is passed, meaning any kind of leverage on that front where they could hold one in order to get them to pass the other is out the window. So the catch is the House going to be willing to pass a bill that gets dramatically scaled back in the Senate? And what leverage do they have to do anything about it, even if it does? And I guess the answer to that is nothing. To have a conversation about Build Back Better and have a conversation about the Rittenhouse case. As you guys know, Rittenhouse basically got off on all charges. We're joined with the one and only Ted Rall. Ted Rall is a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. Ted, thank you for joining us, man. How you doing this morning?
I'm good, Jamal. How are you guys doing?
So far, so good, actually. So I have a clip from President Joe Manchin that I want to play. I'm going to give the engineer time to bring it up. Excellent. But Build Back Better is now going into the Senate after passing the House. What do you think its fate is in the Senate? And let's do this. Let's play the clip first, just so you can hear where we're coming from. This is President Joe Manchin. Let's play the clip.
You were just back home for a week. Do your voters want this bill, this big, massive bill right now?
I think my voters in West Virginia, but I don't speak for the whole country. My voters a lot differently, but they're very much concerned. Inflation has hit them extremely hard. They have to drive. Their mileage for driving to work is quite onerous on them. And the cost, they see it every day. Every day they go up and fill up, it's $1.25 more a gallon. So they're in $3.29, $3.39. Gallon of milk is now around $4 in many places, and it's taking a toll. And I hear it when I go to the grocery store, or if I go to the gas station. They say, "Are you as mad as I am?" And I says, "Absolutely."
Ted, and I think two things are taking place right now that I think are hilarious. So in one sense, Manchin is using inflation as a reason to not support it, basically saying he has questions about it. Cinema, same thing. Whereas Biden is basically using inflation as a reason to support it, which is now trying to cast this bill as this bill is going to deal with inflation. Inflation is horrible, and this bill is going to be the thing that assists and helps with inflation. Basically, here's the problem, but it's now also the solution. What are your thoughts about this? And I guess this goes into two questions. Do you think it's going to get past the Senate? And do you think it's going to get past the Senate unscathed? Meaning it's not going to be 1.75 when it leaves the Senate. It's going to be something dramatically less. What are your thoughts?
Well, first, I didn't know that people in West Virginia drove such heinous distances from their homes to their work. That's an interesting factoid. It's true. Secondly, I was unaware of any kind of serious economist from the left to the right who thinks that government spending bills really have much of an impact on inflation either way. The Fed's monetary policy is what is going to be used to fight inflation. That's been the case for decades. The new Fed chairman, the new old Fed chairman who just got announced, is going to be in charge of that. And so it's a non-discussion. And as for the fate of Build Back Better in the Senate, it's going to be pretty much, I grew up in the 1970s. It'll be pretty much the same fate as those of, cute blonde summer campers at Crystal Lake. It's not going to be good. They're going to get sliced and diced in the Senate. Then I was going to say Back and Beyond, but Build Back Better. the other BBB is not I think they're just going to chop it up. There's not going to be much left. And it's not just because of Manchin and Sinema, even though they're getting all the headlines. They're kind of the tip of the centrist, moderate, corporatist iceberg over there in that part of the Capitol. And Manchin and Sinema are kind of speaking for an invisible bloc.
A voice that doesn't, a bloc that doesn't need to have a voice right now because they're speaking for it. And that's something that I was saying as not a political expert with a lot of this stuff. I've, relatively new, but it struck me as, okay, these guys were making a lot of noise earlier in the year. Then Manchin and Sinema, rose very clearly as the two most prominent voices in the, $15 minimum wage conversation. And then we were the only ones we were hearing about. But there's no reason to think that the people who were, the other dozen or so Democrats in the Senate who were talking about this stuff, there's no reason to think that they would have necessarily changed their minds on it, I think. And, maybe my numbers are slightly off, but it struck me at the time as like, okay, these guys are sort of willing to take the flack. They're willing to get the attention, whatever, for all these unspoken other folks. With Manchin specifically, making the argument about inflation now is a bit on its face, just a turn to, in my opinion, a turn to explain, he got basically the progressives in the House to get the infrastructure bill through. After that, he didn't need them. And then he brings up inflation now after he's gotten what he wanted from them, even though that argument could have made just as much sense a month ago or 3 months ago or 6 months ago or whenever, all of this money had been put out. I guess my point is he could have been making those arguments earlier, and yet there's still a case to be made that with all the money that the government has put into the economy, Trump and Biden over the past year and a half, we're seeing inflation. It's due to government spending. There's a case to be made there. And Biden, it seems, has so ruined his reputation as a president at this point that even, Jamarl, you were saying, even if Biden were to get something through, get what he wants through this BBB plan, it's going to be small. Like you were saying, Ted, it's going to get chopped up into so many pieces. The public's not exactly going to be satisfied with it. And also, the public, hearing a lot about inflation recently, which anyone, again, could have predicted but has been making the news more recently, they're concerned. And I don't know how you can say that's not, I don't want to mischaracterize what you were saying. I'll hand it right back to you. But that clearly was driven by the government putting out large amounts of money, dramatically expanding, as far as I can tell, the money supply in the U.S. of the U.S. dollar. It's like you put more money into the economy, but if you don't have more productivity, if you don't have GDP rising at the same time, that's inflation, kind of mathematically. Ted, what's your take?
Well, first of all, I don't think that's quite true. I don't think that there's any evidence that the Fed has increased the money supply. What we're talking about is government indebtedness. And we don't know that they printed more money. If you look historically at, the national debt and government spending, there's been periods of relative fiscal austerity that were characterized by high inflation and vice versa. I don't think that there's a tie-in here. Not to mention much of the money that, all of the money that pretty much has been pumped into the economy over the last year has actually hit people's pockets was the supplemental COVID spending, right? The other stuff hasn't hit anyone's wallets yet, really. So I think the inflation is coming from pent-up consumer demand. People were sitting at home for 9 to 12 months with nothing to do. Now businesses are reopened. People are going out. They're doing things. They're buying stuff. And yes, they have money to do it with because they have more savings than they used to because of the COVID supplemental unemployment and other rescue funds. But I think that was inevitable. And I don't normally say that I side with Democrats on things, but I kind of think I would have a wait and see attitude as to whether we're now entering a late 70s Carter administration style inflationary romp, or just sort of an uptick following basically the freezing of the economy. I mean, it would be weird if we didn't have some inflation now.
Well, but at the same time, we're seeing inflation. And when you say we're not increasing the money supply necessarily, I get the idea. The Fed goes into debt. But that is the debt that they're going into, as far as I can understand it, comes in the form of money getting pushed out through loans to banks that will then effectively disseminate that money throughout the economy, throughout the system, the economy, in the sort of cascading web of factors. In addition to, the direct stimulus checks, I don't know, of the total amount in the bills passed response to COVID over the last year and a half, I'd be very curious to look at and see, okay, all that money, how much were the stimulus checks? And like what percentage? Because we can untangle a couple of factors when we're talking about these bills, but that is increasing the money supply, isn't it, Ted?
Not necessarily. When the government goes into debt, it can go into trillions and trillions of dollars of additional debt without issuing a single George Washington banknote as a result. They borrow the money from the international market, right, through treasury bonds and notes. Much of the U.S. federal national debt is financed by countries by Chinese investors and people who are buying bonds from around the world. So effectively, we're borrowing money from the global economy. A lot of it's denominated in dollars, but it was originally in euros or in other currencies. So it's an international thing.
But that isn't that inflationary for the U.S. dollar. If you're converting all these euros and yen, et cetera, into dollars, then suddenly you have a glut of dollars compared to the what those dollars are worth.
I would say it's the opposite. I think it would have a deflationary effect because it would increase the demand for those foreign currencies that are then being transferred, that are then being converted over to dollars.
Well, let me ask this in a slightly different way. Do you think that the Build Back Better plan is going to have anything to do with inflation? Meaning the argument that Biden and Psaki and these guys are making now seem to be opportunistic more than anything else. People are concerned about inflation. And because people are concerned about inflation, let's now basically say the Build Back Better is going to do something about inflation. Even if you don't necessarily believe that the money that was basically printed was having some kind of influence on the inflation thing. And I got to be honest, I think it does have some level of influence. I don't necessarily know what the percentage is in regards to influence, but I do think it has some influence. But I also agree that part of this is COVID, and people started, rebuying and everything else, the shipping. I think there's several factors into it. But do you believe that the Build Back Better is going to have any effect on bringing down inflation? I don't necessarily see how that quite works. And yet, this is the argument that these guys are currently making now.
Yeah, well, and also on toward your point, you could also say the labor shortage is also contributing to inflation by rising wages, which necessitates rising consumer prices. I just think it is opportunistic. Look, we need some economists, people who actually study this stuff, to run some studies and some models. And if it exists, I haven't seen it. I don't know if you guys have, but I have not seen any kind of even assertion, even from the right, that says, from the Chicago school type guys, that says, hey, a lot of this kind of infrastructure spending is going to trigger inflation. There was probably the last time this country did a massive amount of infrastructure spending and social spending was during the 1930s under FDR.
But I don't think that's what I don't think. I will copy what you just said. I haven't heard a lot of Chicago school guys just in general recently. I think because they've partly fallen out of favor and MMT has become the thing. But if they were to make those criticisms, we have post-libertarian economists. We have libertarian economists on who identify as ex-libertarians. To put that in context, pretty regularly. This guy named Mark Frost we like to talk to. Anyway, we also have a couple others from across the spectrum. But when Psaki said that no economist is thinking this is going to lead to, I forget the exact phrase that she used, but problematic inflation. Let's use that, something like that. No economist is predicting that this is going to lead to problematic inflation. That seems like that would be a direct lie. But even on it, I don't see them hitting this infrastructure bill specifically. I see them hitting, and by them I mean just a couple economists that I've spoken to and I've read and that we have on the show. They're hitting it on like, wow, it's not the infrastructure, it's the stimulus bills. It's all of the money sent out in the form of checks, which even Mark Frost, our guy, he kind of likes the idea of sending all that money out. He was critical of what it got used for at the time, basically saying instead of people parking this in their 401k or IRA, it is there to stimulate the economy. It's there, you're supposed to spend it and have it circulating, and it wasn't exactly used in that way. Anyway, roundabout way of saying they're not hitting the infrastructure bill. They're hitting these other social spending bills, including the Build Back Better package, right?
Well, that's true. But if we just hone in on that only, on social spending, then we have to look at the 1960s. Was inflation a major problem after the Great Society program? No. Inflation was not a major problem.
But why do we do the Nixon shock, Ted? I'm sorry. Go for it.
Well, I mean, the Nixon shock, I think, was sort of two things happening at the same time, right? It was a sort of a byproduct of losing the Vietnam War and also and obviously the looming energy crisis, right?
Well, looming at that time, but the 70s, I still need to read up on this stuff. My understanding is, had the Nixon shock in the early 70s, the oil crisis, of course, OPEC crisis, which metamorphosed into the stagflation that you were referring to earlier of the sort of mid to late 70s. And that all fits. But the Nixon shock, the way that I've heard this characterized is we withdrew the dollar from the gold standard because of not just the Vietnam War, which is incredibly expensive, but also LBG's Great Society programs you just mentioned. It was exactly for those two factors as the main ones. In other words, these programs, the narrative would go, and of course there are ways to dispute it, obviously. I'm not trying to say it's 100% true, but the narrative would go, LBG's programs 100% did contribute to that inflation. That's why we made that move, and we're sort of living in this fiatized era on the other side where everything's up in the, up for debate about, okay, what's actually going to happen. Ted, what's your take?
Well, if that's true, then it's really interesting that programs that were, passed and started pumping money into the economy in 1965 and 66 didn't actually raise consumer spending to any significant amount until 1977. I was alive during those times. I would say more like, I guess you could also say like 72, 73 when Nixon had to do wage and price controls, which is a really interesting episode in, as an American economic experiment. But it's a long delay. So it's, and with so many factors, it's really hard to tease this out and say, well, it's due to social spending. And how come if it's due to social spending, how come, say, Pentagon spending isn't viewed as having a similar effect?
I agree with you on that one. I'm not here to take an ideological line, although I think even the libertarians would agree with you on that.
Right. So, so the question is, the thing is there a well-recognized correlation, forget about causation, between increased government spending and inflation? I don't think there is. I don't think we can say that. I think it's and if it exists, it has yet to be proven in any kind of way that people can say. So I think getting back to Manchin's argument, he's talking about something as though it was widely accepted and well understood.
Yeah, not to mention Manchin was perfectly fine voting for Trump's tax cuts, and that money, was basically going to people who didn't need it at all at that point. Put that money in the bank as opposed to taxing that money back. I want to move on to Rittenhouse case before we need to close. We only have a few minutes left. What did you think about that verdict? People had been basically forecasting that Rittenhouse was going to get off. You had a judge who was, let's say, at the very least, if nothing else, definitely had a kind eye towards Rittenhouse on that front, basically a right-winger. But beyond the judge part, it seemed that the prosecution was having a difficult time getting across this case, meaning this guy came here with the intention of shooting and being a tough guy, et cetera. Well, they seemed to be able to make that case. In fact, it seemed more like there was, look, my contention is that Rittenhouse put himself in a situation where he needed to defend himself. And in putting himself in that situation, the whole point of him needing to defend himself on some level comes across as self-defense. And that's basically what the jury ran with, that regardless of how the media was presenting this particular story, that he was in a situation where he had to defend himself, and in defending himself, ends up killing two people and wounding one. What is your take on this? I know many people are not going to accept this ruling as legit, and many people will say if he was of a different race, there was no way he would have gotten all of these benefits of the doubt. But nevertheless, the reality is what it is, and Rittenhouse has basically been given a free pass. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm not sympathetic to what he did or to the right-wing politics of apparently Rittenhouse himself or the judge. Right. Just as an aside, I think that in a criminal trial, the judge should always have a kind eye toward the defendant, regardless of who the defendant is, because the burden of proof is on the prosecution, and really every latitude should be extended to the defense more than to the prosecution, in my view. Now, that said, I think the jury voted correctly under Wisconsin law. And I'm really, there was tons of reasonable doubt. I think if I was on that jury, I would have voted to acquit. I don't think I think that, the issue here is that people aren't being thoughtful, including my friends on the left. Look, do I like the fact that this little punk thug went to, basically play junior super cop, 17 years old, brandishing military hardware at a riot? No. And should that be illegal? Yeah. But is it? No. And so, if you have a problem with that, then what you need to do is agitate for, change in, if you live in Wisconsin, you want to agitate for, I don't think a 17-year-old kid should be allowed to have a gun at all, except perhaps on the shooting range under the supervision of an adult. I don't think, I don't think vigilantism should be tolerated. Like, you go to a place, you're not allowed to be a freelance super cop on the street. And this happens all the time, right? Even when there aren't shootings at, BLM and other protests where these right-wingers show up, that should be illegal too, but it's not.
Here's where I make the point that America is the world police and everybody imitates them, all of our Americans. And, I think there's something to it, but I don't want to just lead on that one.
Basically, you can't be shocked at him doing this since we do this around
since
the world.
We do this kind of thing. And there's something to it, but I don't know if I just take philosophical, ironic pleasure in it or something. I don't know if there's a direct causative factor. Anyway, Ted, you're often erudite. You got matter of fact there. And I think part of what went down in this case is the prosecution. Well, it's not erudite because it's not even that they were smart or making good points. They were like citified or something. There was a cultural disconnect. And clearly the judge did lean right on this, but I would argue the defense, this Tommy Lee, two people on the defense, one who was doing most of the talking, doing most of the, questioning of witnesses and such. He was more the Tommy Lee Jones kind of matter of fact, to the point, doesn't say too many words. The prosecution, on the other hand, is this more like city dwelling, says a lot, kind of schmoozy or something like that. I don't know. And so culturally, there was this mismatch just going into the trial. But clearly, a lot of people have, on the right, taken this as a sign of success after last year's Black Lives Matter protests. And here's where I want to kind of come in to push back, representing whatever that is, representing the right wing in this one. When you say that, we shouldn't have vigilantes out on the streets, he shouldn't be a super cop, that kind of thing. I agree with you. We shouldn't have vigilantes. This isn't the Wild West, and we should, expect more. But isn't it because the cops weren't on the scene that night that he felt it was necessary to go out and do this stuff? He didn't go out there intending to shoot people, from what he said and from everything that we heard during the trial. He went out there trying to put out fires and provide medical aid because the police were nowhere to be found. Because, the night before, he'd seen the streets on fire and rioters, not just protesters, but people actively like destroying public property and business property, all this stuff. People out there, the cops were nowhere to be seen. So, you got to address the other side of this too, of course, which is what a lot of people looking at this are thinking. It's not just the vigilante going out there. It's why did he feel that it was necessary? And I would really like to hear the left sort of respond to that substantively. Because that's I feel like that's a big part of the conversation here, Ted.
Look, I have friends who have, small businesses, and they pour their entire lives into it. You can imagine how horrible it is to watch your business be vandalized, looted, burned. The insurance may or may not be there for you. You may or may not be able to recover. It's traumatic, and I definitely see why people are motivated in situations like this to go and try to quote unquote protect them. But again, it's one of those things where it's just not, the vigilantism is not it should not be an appropriately legal remedy to a societal failing. The absence of police on the ground to restore law and order, the problem there is, the solution to that is to send the police and to hire more and to, have them go out there. It's not to say, okay, well, we're going to freelance this. We often talk about the dysfunction of this society, and this is an example of dysfunction. We have a clear problem, and we kind of know what we should do to solve it, but instead of just taking it on, addressing it head on, we try to do some kind of sleazy workaround. It's kind of like, look, a lot of people on the left don't like guns. What they won't admit is that they want to repeal or curtail the Second Amendment. Then what they should do is go out and agitate to do that. And the same thing is true about vigilantism. It's like, if you think there aren't enough cops on the street in a situation like this, then agitate for more cops on the street in situations like this. It's the fact that we know that we can't amend the Constitution, we know that we can't count on the political class to try to address our problems, much less solve them, is why we're reduced to trying to skirt around and go between the lines and figure things out on our own.
On that point, I agree with you 100%. And that's both protesters and the vigilantes, or the rioters and the vigilantes, or whatever, some mixture of the two, are sort of responding to the same dysfunction. But surely, Kyle Rittenhouse going out there, not going to try to kill somebody, but going to try to put out fires, that kind of thing. Surely he is at least as justified going out the night of as the people who are going out to light the dumpsters on fire and who were setting the buildings the night before. If we're going to make the argument that what he's doing isn't the right way to help the problems that society has, can't we make the same argument about the people who were literally destroying the city the night before? Can't that argument be made against them per force compared to Rittenhouse?
Well, no, because Rittenhouse went out and destroyed 3 people while those people were burning down businesses. So he was just taking a bad situation and making it worse. He may have thought he was going out to help, but he didn't help. That's the problem. It's, Why
did they attack him? It all gets weird because he brings the AR-15, and I get that that's a sort of not aggravating factor in a legal sense, but that
provocative.
It's provocative. Thank
nothing
you.
else. Yeah.
Exactly, Jamarl. I get that. But on the other hand, he didn't go out there trying to kill them. They went out there apparently ready to kill him, and he defended himself according to the jury and according to, again, from what you said, didn't break any laws here. And it's not like he was going out with a red dot sight looking for people to shoot down or whatever. It's not, and that's what the case the prosecution was trying to make. Anyway, Ted, we're kind of close to our outro. What's your take?
Real quick, though, to be fair, depending on who he was there with, would set kind of a tone in regards to how people perceive him being there. Like, if he's there with a particular group and the group has been antagonistic, because keep in mind, these groups, at this point, across several states across the United States, these guys have been bringing in weapons, food, resources, bottles, etc. And both sides. It wasn't even one of those situations where you had one group that was a core protest group, but you had other groups that were associated with it that was causing all sorts of mayhem. And so you almost had like these sides lining up to basically fight. Yeah. There was a certain right-wing energy that went along with people who were going there to, let's say, anti-protesters and people who were going there as protesters.
As was clear with the whole like Antifa versus Proud Boys thing. And with this particularly, I'm still like, I don't know exactly where Kyle in his heart of hearts is on, okay, what was his actual motivation there? And I get that question.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that part. It's like if he's there with a group and that group is seen as to be antagonistic to the protesters, it may be, in the bricks at that point in regards to the conflict. And it becomes, unclear in regards to how that stuff breaks out. Well, at this point, we know how it broke out. But what are your thoughts, Ted, just as a final comment on the Rittenhouse trial?
Oh, there's the 2 guys who got killed aren't, unless we have a seance, we're not going to know what they were thinking at the time that, they went after him, right? So, look, like I said, I would have voted to acquit also because it certainly he did have a good reason to believe that he was defending himself. But, we don't know if what these 2 guys would have said. They might have said, like, holy cow, this guy was brandishing this very big gun. We were scared. We thought he was going to shoot us. We thought we were defending ourselves. We were trying to stop him. We're just not going to know that. And that's exactly where I keep coming back to. Going there should be illegal, but it's not. And so the verdict was correct, but the societal problem continues.
Agreed. And by the way, I tried to do a seance with Joseph Rosenbaum, but he touched me when I did the seance. Not good. No, I'm just kidding. That's a racy joke. Ted, thank you for joining us this morning.
Too soon.
I know it's too soon. Thank you for joining us this morning. It's always really good talking with you.
Likewise.
And for those listening, that was Ted Rall, political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. Follow Ted on Twitter at Ted Rall. Read his cartoons and articles at raw.com. Yeah, it's a racy joke. I might regret that one. But you know what? Let me do the thing
Personally, I think it's funny.
I think it's kind of funny too, but let me do the thing. What would make it not funny is the reality that this dude was a pedophile who touched people, and I'm joking about that. Yeah. But let's just take the moment to remind ourselves that the first guy was literally a pedophile who repeatedly raped multiple kids, boys specifically. Anyway. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break. We'll be coming back taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Back in just a moment.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Again, that's 202-521-1320. And we've been covering some stories this morning. We've been talking about stuff. So in terms of the range of topics you could want to bring up if you're going to call in, there are many. And again, the number is 202-521-1320. Jamarl.
Yes.
And where you want to go?
I think what Ted was saying, I think he took a pretty decent middle ground on the Rittenhouse verdict, to be honest. He was like, look, if I was there, I would have acquitted. By the same token, this punk shouldn't have went. Yeah, I mean, especially with all of the media and everything else, the media took a very specific tact on this case that made it seem like it was clear-cut, black and white, et cetera. It also took this tact that it was heavily racial, despite the fact everybody shot was basically white. I think it's probably because it was all of that stuff got put under Black Lives Matter protests, and so anything that took place took this kind of weird racial element associated with it.
But briefly, I'd also say there's probably something intentional about that, about the specific things they choose to not cover in this story.
Yeah.
Like, I get that, but I would go one step further. There's a bad faith take, which is they're explicitly leaving things out about the story because they want to leave people with false negative impressions of Kyle Rittenhouse.
Yeah.
Who, by the way, just to be clear, I've defended the jury, but he was also, in my opinion, a fool in a lot of ways for heading out there that night. And I would argue that, you know, you don't want to incentivize that kind of thing, but still the question is left, what do you do in response to mayors and governors not letting police go out and protect their cities when people are coming in to burn them down?
Yeah. I mean, and it goes the other way too. I mean, what do you do about cops who basically kill people and create all sorts of consternation in the public that incentivize those people to basically
How do you deal with both of those? Yeah.
I mean, it's a lot of the stuff to me doesn't fall down into right and wrong. It falls down into expected consequence. And this is one of those cases. It's like this kind of weird pretzeling where right and wrong doesn't necessarily give you any good answers on it. It's almost like, is this foreseeable to take place as a result of X? Like, well, yeah. Right and wrong matters? No, it doesn't. And it seems to go that way in both ways. I mean, Rittenhouse did seem to have some kind of connection with Wisconsin, his family and everything else. Apparently, he didn't take the gun there. It was a gun that he basically picked up, which is why they basically dropped that in court. Most of those things, I mean, at least in that capacity, wasn't necessarily entirely accurate. This notion that he went with the notion of going to kill us, again, that doesn't entirely seem accurate. Yes, he took the gun, but in the case of the gun, it's almost like it is so provocative to be walking around with a weapon like that. By the same token, if he didn't have it, then what? Like, all of that stuff comes into play. It gets very murky after a while.
And you know what? If Kyle Rittenhouse, we got a caller. So I think I will, instead of making my point, which we might want to come back to. I might go back to it at some point, but we get a caller. I just realized we should probably get to them. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Let's go to Mr. Boston calling in from Massachusetts. Mr. Boston, what's on your mind this morning?
Liberty.
Liberty is on Mr. Boston's mind. Right on. What about liberty, Mr. Boston?
It's the principles that this nation, we all came to an agreement upon, that we revolted against the crown because we didn't get the liberty and freedom that we were after. But if you look at our society now and the way that it is trying to squelch free speech, you get to peeling back the layers of the onion. And from what I can tell is that they sent Prince Harry here to police free speech in Silicon Valley, which means all over the country.
Wait, you got to unpack that for a second. You're bringing up Prince Harry and Silicon Valley. Is there a news story that I'm not aware of?
Liberty.
Mr. Boston.
Well, you must understand Dr. Shiva. Basically, he had a lawsuit saying, I'm running for government here. They kicked me off during my political campaign. And free speech for politics is something that you're allowed to criticize any politician in this country.
So Dr. Shiva, who has been a guest on the show, is a COVID skeptic, and we haven't had him on in a long time, but he has a substantial following. I'm seeing 5-6 days ago talking about how Prince Harry is the Duke of censorship, and I'm trying to figure out exactly what happened here. Could you give us a Cliff Notes version of what's going on in this story, Mr. Boston, please?
So basically, he campaigned in 2020 and the year subsequently before that, and he noticed something, like how many people were like how much it was promoted to people, and apparently that there's a secret line for politicians to contact the social media companies, and he got discovery in the courtroom, and he had to look. The man wasn't a lawyer. He didn't start out as a lawyer. He has 5 degrees from MIT and Harvard, etc. In fact, they don't enjoy smart people getting into government because it peels back the layers and exposes something they don't like the average person to know. But the reason why I call you up and I haven't called you in the past is because they want to take away freedom and our ability to speak freely.
Who's they, Mr. Boston?
But also, why wouldn't you call in?
Democracy.
Mr. Boston, who's they?
The people, the elites of our society. I would say there's probably about, there are many people who are made to be elites because they have newly printed billionaires as a smokescreen. But there's something like 302 families that pull the strings and purse strings of government. And I'm a big fan of Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson.
I lean more in that direction, too. I'm not in the Hamiltonian wing. I've gotten into arguments with Daniel Lazare specifically about that old philosophical disagreement. And I, of course, see, the standing up to the crown thing with Dr. Shiva alleging that Prince Harry, it sounds like, had a hotline to social media companies. But what is he alleging that Prince Harry did with that hotline? I'm still trying to figure out the facts of the story itself. What is Dr. Shiva saying Prince Harry did to suppress information?
It's not Prince Harry himself. But, for example, there's an agreement in Massachusetts that we'll give you Republican X, but you have to take, Democrat Y into such and such position. And there's this weird balance that goes on. And meaning the chips and the game are always rigged in a favor.
Yeah, I don't know about that one, man. I buy the general take, but I'm gonna end the call now. Mr. Boston, thank you for calling in. I will admit that, yeah, so there's this idea that there is this international elite of families, like former members of the European aristocracy, for instance, that has outsized power, and I will totally grant that. I don't buy that they're directing everything. It's not like a marionette controlled by these aristocrats, because frankly, a lot of them seem out of touch.
Yeah.
And, they're just decadent remnants of royalty or something. And I'm skeptical of a lot of the more, I don't know, I push back on it on this show. The idea that there is a grand conspiracy. I buy that there are a lot of individual conspiracies, but it reminds me too much of the Illuminatus trilogy and this wave of, people who are, sort of overarching Illuminati-style conspiracy theories. Everything's tied together. And I love the idea because it would make sense of literally everything. Yeah. But when I look into them pretty consistently, I'm like, there's not anything there. And there's this continuation of people wanting to make those kinds of arguments about whether it's the Rockefellers or the Rothschilds or the Great Reset. Yeah. And I don't know, maybe it's my bias, but I kind of throw them all under the same banner.
I think for them, they feel comfortable that, okay, they look around, they say this stuff doesn't make any sense. And because it doesn't make sense, there has to be a controlling hand that's controlling that stuff. I don't think so. I think this stuff, a lot of this stuff turns out to be random, where people are just kind of clawing for their own ends and you come up with weird phenomena.
Oh, yeah. I think there's some truth to a lot of this stuff, but the idea that it's all tied together, I don't know. I think some people take it too far, but regardless. We got to close this show out. Mr. Boston, thank you for the call. Thank you, everybody, for listening to us this morning. We will be back tomorrow, and we're going to be off this Thursday and Friday. Just a quick heads up before we close out our show today. Again, back tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. Eastern. Hope you all have a great day. See you on the other side.